It's now 6:30. Call into order the Board of Directors regular meeting, Trophy Club Municipal Utility District Number 1. We have a quorum. All 5 directors are present. Citizens' comments. This is an opportunity for citizens to address the board on any matter, whether or not it's posted on the agenda. The board is not permitted to take action or to discuss any comments made to the board at this time concerning an item not listed on the agenda. The board will hear comments on specific agenda items prior to the board addressing those items. You may speak up to 4 minutes or the time limit determined by the president or presiding officer. To speak during the term, you must complete the speaker form that includes the topics of your statement. Citizens' comments should be limited to matters of which the board has authority. Any citizens' comments?
No.
Thank you, madam. We'll proceed to consent agenda. All matters listed as consent agenda are considered to be routine by the board of directors and will be enacted by one motion. There will not be a separate discussion of these items. If discussion is desired, that item will be removed from the consent agenda and will be considered separately. Item number 1, consider and take appropriate action to approve the consent agenda. A, May 2019 check register. B, May 20, 2019 regular meeting minutes. Entertain a motion.
I move that we approve the consent agenda. May 2019 check register, May 20, 2019 regular minutes.
We have a motion by Secretary Treasurer Flynn to approve the May 2019 check register and May 20, 2019 regular meeting minutes.
I'll second.
Second by Director Castanway. All right. All in favor indicate by raising your hand. All opposed? I'll abstain since I wasn't here at the meeting to opine on those. Okay, we'll now enter regular session. Consider and take appropriate action to elect officers of the board. I'll entertain a motion for anyone who wants to consider one, or if somebody wants to offer commentary.
I think this is exclusively a board matter, so I don't know if Tony has any advice for it.
Mr. President, I don't know how we do this, but my
Somebody just makes a
opinion.
motion.
It's a nomination.
Okay.
Nominate somebody.
Well,
Nominations do not require a second, just for the record.
Yeah.
can we nominate the entire board at one point, or do we have to go position by position?
By
So you can
position.
do the, huh?
Position by
position.
position is,
Position, okay. If we're gonna start with president, I nominate Greg to continue on as president.
Okay, I'm willing to serve. Any other?
Does he need a second?
No seconds necessary. Since you have the floor, you want to continue?
we can vote on it.
You want to vote on it? Okay. We have a nomination by Secretary Treasurer Flynn to nominate me to continue as president. All in favor indicate by raising your hand. Motion passes unanimously. Do we have another nomination?
Go ahead. I I nominate Mr. Rose to continue on as vice president in that position as well.
I have a second nomination by Secretary Treasurer Flynn to have Vice President Rose continue in that capacity.
I was looking forward to being fired.
You was looking forward to being fired.
You do such a great job.
Yes. All right. Any comments, questions, snide remarks? I'll save those for after the meeting. If everyone in favor indicate by raising your hand.
I'll abstain.
Motion passed unanimously with Vice President Rose abstaining. And
Don't look at me, I'm abstaining from this next vote.
I think we should keep a clean slate, and I nominate Mr. Flynn as our Secretary Treasurer.
okay, we have a motion for Secretary Treasurer Flynn to remain as a as a Secretary Treasurer. Any comments, questions? Hearing none, all in favor indicate by raising your hand. Motion passes unanimously. We now have elected officers.
You guys, next year, you guys.
As you said last year, we managed to dodge it twice now.
It ain't happening the third time.
Okay, item number 2, consider and take appropriate action regarding the 2018. I'm sorry, item number 3, consider and take appropriate action regarding the 2018 Consumer Confidence Report. Staff?
Mr. President, included in your packet is a copy of the 2018 Consumer Confidence Report prepared by the staff, primarily by Lori. I think she's done a great job on that. We've also produced the draft version, which the town uses. I can't remember, have they considered that already? Was that on their last agenda?
On their 23rd agenda.
23rd agenda.
23rd agenda.
So they are close but not identical documents, and that relates to the way the rule reads. Nonetheless, I guess we're asking for the board to adopt or accept the Consumer Confidence Report. Is there specific language for it? I think just accept it. It's probably okay.
I move to approve the 2018 Annual Drinking Water Quality Report.
I'll second.
I have an amendment.
Okay, we have a motion to approve the 2018, let's see what you called it,
Annual Drinking Quality.
the Annual Drinking Water Quality Report. Motion by Vice President Rose and seconded by Direction.
Gotta get it done.
Director Chapman.
Okay, if you go,
So, what's your amendment?
to page 18 of the packet, go to the column on the bottom right, and it says, for more information on source water assessments and protection efforts at our system, contact. I think that should probably be in our system.
Fair enough.
Okay, I move to,
Consider that a friendly amendment.
I move to change in the last sentence on the right-hand column of page 1 of the report. I move to change at to in.
Okay. Do you, he has to, do you accept that amendment?
Just do a second
Yeah.
and vote on it.
Okay.
quicker.
Second it.
Yeah. So that amendment to change at our system made by Vice President Rose, seconded by Secretary Treasurer Flynn. Any other comments, questions? Okay, first, let's deal with the amendment. So the first vote will be to accept the amendment to change at our system to in our system. There are no other questions. Everyone in favor indicate by raising your hand. Motion passes unanimously. Now we'll go back to the first motion, which is to accept the 2018 Annual Drinking Water Quality Report
As amended.
As amended.
as amended. Any other discussion? Hearing none, everyone in favor indicate by raising your hand. Motion passes unanimously. Next item, consider and take appropriate action regarding sale of surplus equipment. Consider and take appropriate action to adopt order number 2019-0617A, declaring certain electronic equipment of the district to be surplus and authorizing the disposal thereof. B, consider and take appropriate action to adopt order number 2019-01617B, declaring the district interest in certain joint property owned by the district and the town of Trophy Club to be surplus and authorizing disposal thereof. And C, consider and take appropriate action to adopt order number 2019-0617C, declaring certain property of the district related to the fire department to be surplus and authorizing the disposal thereof. Staff?
Mr. President, these three orders, as I understand them, relate to authorizing the staff to dispose of electronic equipment held in different forms. So that includes stuff that is entirely owned by the MUD, items that are jointly owned by the town and the MUD, and things that are owned by the fire department that are capital in nature. So there are 3 separate orders, and the staff recommends approval of all of these orders.
I have a question, Carmen. So if you looked at, I am on slide 32. Looks like there's a bunch of laptop computers and servers. So all of that, these are old laptops? These are, what,
Slide, excuse me, slide
32.
slide 32?
slide
Nope.
32?
Is that a page number?
Page 32.
I'm sorry, page 32 in the,
Okay, we'll get there just a second. Is it already here?
so these are all old that were replaced, obviously?
Yeah, so what you're looking at is a jointly owned between the town and the mud. These are all that have been sitting in the upper part of the fire station in different various rooms and storages that are outdated and no longer in use.
What's gonna happen to these? How do they get disposed of?
So we can take these kind of separately. The items you're looking at right now, which are the highlighted items, these are jointly owned. The jointly owned stuff, the town's IT is going to erase and take care of the hard drives on their end. They have some software that's able to erase it their side. I believe they're going through a 3-process array system for it. I don't believe they're destroying it, as far as my understanding. I think they're just erasing the hard drives, but I have to get with Pastor to make sure on that. And then the rest of it's going to be sold at auction. The stuff that is solely owned by the mud, which is a little bit higher up, you'll see a kind of a report from M3, which is our third-party contract for our IT department that we use. They are actually going to dispose of the hard drives. They're going to take them, erase them, degloss them, and actually physically damage them. So all that's going to be
Degloss 'em?
less. Degloss them, I guess is what he says,
Yeah,
right?
so
Yeah.
degauss as
Yeah,
well.
degauss.
Yeah, they're gonna
correct,
degloss.
right.
Okay.
The town is a little bit different. I'm not an IT whiz. I know my way around them, but as far as how they get destroyed, they have some software that erases them. It's a 3-cycle.
A DO,
Process.
Well, DOD wipe is 7, not 3. So
Okay.
that's interesting.
So I mean, something I can try to reach out from that. But as far as our stuff, we were actually physically destroying them. They're going to take care of them, and then all that's going to be left is a casing of like the laptops and stuff like that, which have no real value at all.
So the laptop, I mean, are they totally useless? Can they be used at all? I'm donated
mean,
to schools
these
or
are-
something? I don't,
Delete the hard drive, they're
Yeah.
worthless to anybody. People need to buy a new computer. Somebody's not gonna go buy parts, and most of the time you can't find those parts anymore for an old,
And we're talking about laptops that are a decade old that just have no value at all to them.
yeah.
10 years old, probably their IDE drives to begin with. No one wants those. Nowadays, it's all SATA. So,
I mean,
the only
I
only
have
item
no
I-
idea what that means, but I'll take your
it's a
word for
different
it.
It's a
electronic
very
format.
old technology. Yeah.
Sales guy, what do I know about
10 years old, it's probably IDE,
Yeah,
and
you're
no
a
one
sales
wants
guy.
that.
It's a brand new computer to you.
That's all I need to know. That's all I need to know.
Are they going to publish when they're going to do this auction?
yes, this goes to their council on the next meeting coming up here in June. And then they're gonna, I guess they have to, I think by law, right, they have to post when it goes on auction, what date and where is that.
Okay. Because did you notice, Greg, at the very bottom of that thing is a PowerVault DLT drive?
Yeah.
I could still use one of those.
I don't think you, I don't know, is he eligible to purchase?
I don't believe so.
I don't think you're eligible to purchase.
At the auction.
At auction?
Yeah, I don't know.
Shared?
Can he do it?
The auction, you could. as long
Have
as
your
it's
wife
a
do it.
true Public auction.
Every neighbor do it.
Yeah,
Bring
I
it
mean,
in.
I'm not asking to buy it ahead of time and try to cheat somebody out of it. I just,
For 10% commission, I'll get you the best deal.
Spoken like a true treasurer?
yeah, really.
The finance department has nothing to do with that?
We may have to have an executive session for counseling purposes.
It's an arm's length transaction for T-Rexes.
Yeah.
My wife would probably shoot.
So we would have, so on this, we'd have M3 take care of everything on our end. We have some really old desktop, stuff like that, that's cream color and the nature of it, so it's pretty old stuff there, and they're just gonna completely dispose, so we won't have anything to do with it on our end. They'll just come by, pick it up, and take care of it all. And then, like I said, with the town stuff, once they get everything in, we're just gonna split down the middle and whatever they get from auction, minus the fees and everything.
Vice President Rose?
I move to approve order number 2019-0617A, declaring certain electronic equipment of the district to be surplus and authorizing the disposition thereof.
Okay, we have a A motion by Vice President Rose to approve order number 2019-0617A, declaring certain electronic equipment of the district surplus and authorize disposal thereof. Do I have a
Second.
second? I have a second by Secretary Treasurer Flynn. Any other discussion? Hearing none, all in favor indicate by raising your hand. Motion passes unanimously.
I have a motion.
Go ahead, Vice President Rose.
I move to approve order number 2019-0617B, declaring the district's interest in certain joint property owned by the district and the town of Trophy Club to be surplus and authorizing disposition thereof.
Okay, we have a motion by Vice President Rose to adopt order 2019-0617B, declaring the district interest in certain joint property owned by the district and the town of Trophy Club to be surplus and authorizing disposition thereof. Do I have a second? I'll second it. Oh, any other discussion? Hearing none, all in favor indicate by raising your hand. Motion passes unanimously.
I have a motion. We're going to abbreviate this one.
I appreciate that.
I move to approve order number 2019-0617B.
We have a motion to
I
approve.
mean C. We
C,
did B.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
C. We did B.
See what happens when
Corrected to
you
C.
amend it? Brevity throws you off.
It didn't get a check mark.
We have a motion by Vice President Rose to approve order number 2019-0617 Charlie. C.
I do have a question. I'm
Oh,
noting.
well, we need a second, then we can go into discussion.
I'll second.
It's seconded by Director Chapman. Any discussion?
Yes, we didn't actually look at what was going, there's no secondary purpose for those portable radios and that stuff, because I know Denton County runs and our various CERT and other volunteer efforts are looking for radios and that stuff all the time.
So when they have to get new radios, a lot of times they have to upgrade so they can stay on the channels with everybody else. And those usually aren't replaced until they have to be replaced. There's usually things wrong with them, or they're so out of date you can't. Wade would keep anything that's still working, I'm sure.
Well, it's,
Yeah, but
well,
it's-
if it's in the ham radio band, those tend to stay in the same bands.
Yeah, for ham, you would still be able to
Most
use
of
it.
these are running in ham
Yeah.
bands.
So these will be auctioned. It's not like we're just gonna throw them in the trash or anything like that. They will be auctioned.
Okay,
These are the items that'll go to auction.
that's fine, yeah,
You can get with Denton County, see if they want to come and do a purchase.
I'll know, there's Dakota or whatever that's part of Denton County, I'll let them know.
Yeah.
A whole bunch of this gear.
Any other discussion? Hearing none, all in favor indicate, everyone remembers the motion?
C.
Si, senor. Well, all in favor indicate by raising your hand. Motion passes unanimously. Item number 5, discuss and possible action regarding adoption of amended and restated reserve fund policy.
Mr. President, somewhere between 90 and 120 days ago, our Reserve Policy Subcommittee brought forth a draft reserve fund policy that was not successfully adopted by the board. At that time, one of the members of the committee had offered to try to simplify it to help the policy, or at least the policy concept, meet with what he perceived to be the center of the board's gravity, if you will, around what was an approvable approach forward on reserve policy. So with that, I would also add that there's been new guidance documentation out from the American Waterworks Association around reserve policy. That document is provided by Director Rose and is in the packet for your review. But I think at this point, we want to hear from Director Flynn about his notions for simplifying the reserve structure. Is that fair?
Okay. Lori, do we have our slide, our PowerPoint slide?
It's up front. You're talking about the presentation?
I'm sorry?
The presentation?
The ones, yeah, yeah. Yep, great.
You're gonna have to walk around unless you're gonna make her get up every time. Not quite the gentleman I thought you were if you had opted for that.
If you thought I was a gentleman, that's operator error. Okay, we've had a lot of discussion about this, as we all well know. And what we're looking at is, we put together, actually, Bill was in the discussions, Carmen, so there was a number of folks that kind of helped get this to where we're at. On the right-hand side is the current proposal. This is what we've kind of drafted here within the MUD. And what Bill was helpful in providing was AWA guidelines, and I think what you're going to see as we go down here slide by slide is what we've kind of drafted from our current proposal very much lines up with AWWA guidelines. So there is a operating reserve bucket, if you will. There is a capital reserve bucket, and within that, some very similar things: rehabilitation replacement reserves, equipment replacement reserves, emergency capital reserves, and the only other difference is AWWA had a special purpose capital reserves, which we did not suggest in ours. There are debt reserves in both of the proposals, rate stabilization reserves, and non-spendable reserves as well, although that's not included in the AWWA. I'm not sure if this slide.
This is
too
from
much
water, this is from the Water Research Foundation.
Oh, this is the
other
water
is-
research. Okay,
yeah.
so yeah, we did two comparisons. Thank you, Bill. Water research, again, we were looking at AWWA as well as water research. I think what you're going to find here is water research is very similar to what this is, although there are some differences. Really, the comparison we want to go back to is AWWA. So I think, in summary, we tried to take what was a lot of different, I'll call them buckets, if you will, and narrow that down. That was really the direction from the board, at least as I heard it. And coincidentally, line it up with what AWWA suggests as well. So I think we've done a great job of going from what I'll call overly prescriptive to pretty workable. So I'll entertain discussion about what we're looking at, and then we can talk about next steps after that.
So I guess my question, are we advocating so beyond the theoretical to actual reserve accounts having maybe 3 reserves, one operating reserve, then a capital reserve, and then that capital reserve made up of those 4 categories? So let's say, I'm making up numbers, $1 million, and then, 40% of it's rehabilitation and replacement, so we justify that number. Equipment replacement, we justify that number. Emergency capital reserves, we justify that number, but there's one account called capital reserves, and then one called operating reserve or balance sheet entry. Can you go down to the next one, please? Next page, please. And then I guess, I don't know if there's a way to group those. So, or are we talking about having 8 different reserve line items?
Well, it's really 3, 4, 5 reserve buckets.
Okay.
And within the capital reserve, there are other, call them subcategories. Bill can speak to it. I'm not an advocate personally I'm an advocate of having those called out, those rehabilitation, equipment, emergency, and have targets, maybe, guidelines, targets. But I guess I'm not an advocate of having an exact budget line item for that, because to me, that gets back to, kind of complication. But I'll let Bill speak to it as well.
Okay, let me, okay, so we've got the first page here. So went down through this list, kind of do a little backtracking here. We kind of got, as we worked as a group, got sidetracked off onto GASB and GASB designations. And after I looked at it and reread the 2018 AWWA cash policy guideline standards, brought it back in. Most of the categorization was very close or the same between what we had before, some minor changes, some minor tweaks, which we went ahead and made to bring it into alignment with the American Water Works. As Steve mentioned, the special purpose capital reserves down there are not included, and they're not included because we don't have something that would fit in that category. That's a case where you do a special assessment for a special project, special group. For example, we might do an assessment in something in Westlake that was only going to serve Westlake. We don't have anything like that, so we have absolutely no need for that. If you go to the next slide, please. On this slide, what this slide highlights, as well as we'll flip to the next ones also, this one highlights that AWWA guidelines does not have a non-spendable reserve category. These are things which we called non-spendable reserves, were things like deposits that people make. And I think the reason that they're not included in AWWA is, long story short, you can't spend them. They're not something that we could really consider a reserve that we might be able to get spendable. Okay, if you go to the next slide. Okay, we've talked about the American Water Works Association. The Water Research Foundation was a group that was started by AWWA as a research organization, and so they also put out their information. You start out and go down from the top. Everybody all have the operating reserves. The Water Research Foundation has capital projects reserve, but when you read the definitions in it, it closely parallels the rehabilitation and replacement reserves in our proposal in AWWA. The renewal and extension reserves, once again, closely parallel definitions for equipment replacement reserves. And in my mind, the AWWA has better terminology. Water Research Foundation calls them insurance reserves. AWWA, and in our proposal, they're called emergency reserves, which also incorporate the insurance category. Next one, please. Debt service reserves, same on both sides. Rate stabilization reserves, same on both sides. And once again, the non-spendable reserves are not included in the Water Research Foundation's discussion. And so once again, I think it's a case of it's something you might want to pull across or look at as being GASB driven. But as everybody looks at just the reserves within the industry, and GASB doesn't, they're not included. GASB does not say you are this type of an organization, you need these particular types of reserves. All they say is if you have funds categorized, then you will categorize them in these particular ways. And one of those ways is a non-spendable reserve. So long story short, I would propose that we take that one out of ours. But I'm open, and as far as how they work, if you go back to the first slide, Steve, okay, capital reserves is a title heading, and each one of those below that title are carried independently. Now, how that operates or would operate, as I see it, is we would make a determination based on whatever the situations are, what we think our reserves should be in each one of those categories. And then we fund to them. Now, quite frankly, without having numbers to go against those, and until we decide what we're going to do, it's too early to put numbers against it. That was a point that Tony brought up, I think, on the first round. He said, oh, where are the numbers? Where are you funding to? So that is a very valid point, and that's someplace where we need to be. But in order to get there, you've got to get through the first steps to begin with. We do that. What we can do is after we look at this and determine what our categories are, and we can have, the staff can tell us kind of what the numbers should be in there, and we get a feeling for where we should be, then that becomes a budgeting factor. Some of the organizations, some of the documents that I have seen have, they will say certain percentage by a certain year. They'll say, we want X number of dollars, and they will say the goal is to fund 50% or 20% this year, 20% each following year to reach those, and then they track it to reach their goal. That's one of the ways that's handled. But what you've got, you know, we talk about this, see, you know, where the board wants to go. If you want.
So, I guess, you know, my still question is, and Greg, maybe you brought it up, is, you know, how many buckets do we have here, okay?
Yeah, for me, so to Bill's point, there is the non-spendable.
Yeah.
Now, to me, and this is probably a question more towards Stephen, the two that I'm definitely aware of would be customer deposits, and that's something that we have to hold, and that's a separate line item in the budget, correct?
That's correct. So the two that we have, so the non-spendable, as Vice President Rose is talking about, is GAS 54, which is terminology, the definitions on that way every entity is able to say the same terminology there. The non-spendable is going to be customer deposits, that's the big one. And then we also do auditor ahead of time. We have to pay the auditor up front, and then we turn around and pay ourselves back. But it gets held. There's that 5,000 gets held in there.
So
It's called a prepaid, basically, which is a non-spendable.
okay, so that's a non-spendable reserve, the 5,000 for the auditor?
It's not a reserve. This is where we
Or
kind of
a
this is
non-
where we
okay.
ran off to a kind of a veered off a different path. What we were trying to do, one of the questions comes across. I know you and I've had discussion with this in meetings. Is I want to look at the cash report and see how much we have in reserves. Well, there's a lot of moving parts in the cash report, which shows where all those funds are at and how they're located. For instance, the non-spendable, it's in there as a non-spendable. It's not really a reserve. It's money that we set aside and we cannot touch. It means customer deposits. If everybody was to pull their money out tomorrow or close their account out tomorrow, that money needs to be
We have
available at
to-
all
yeah.
time. Correct.
Yeah, and I guess for me, I just never envisioned the audit falling in that category.
Prepaid is a non-spendable. That's the terminology. Is part of it. Prepaid, and it's a prepaid. We budget each year to have that money at the time before the fiscal year ends. We pay it ahead of time, but then we basically, in October comes around, we turn around and pay it back to ourselves
Yeah.
and put it back in. So
So a second one is related to bonds. So when you issue bonds, you have to have a certain amount of payments that are held.
So those aren't actually non-spendable. Those aren't part of the non-spendable. Those are committed.
Those are debt service reserves.
They're listed as GAS 54 as committed. So they're a different category. And the very first reserve policy that was kind of brought out I think it was 2 months ago, I believe it was 3 months ago, 3 meetings ago, we kind of had to separate as what's restricted, what's committed, and kind of all those break out for GAS 54. So those are in here. They're just going to be labeled differently. Now you've got a couple different things for bonds. So you have the actual payments that we save aside every month for bonds, and then after every 6 months, basically we clean those out and pay the bonds off, pay the interest, and then pay the interest and principal in September. Then you also have what's in the bond covenants, which is we have to have 5 years of payments. I'm sorry, we have 5 years to get to 1 full year of payments, which is in our bond covenants. So as we go out for more revenue bonds, we have to increase that amount that needs to be put aside for it. And that is your debt reserve that's set aside.
Okay, and so in my mind, I see those as quote-unquote non-spendables. I know we use different nomenclature, but that's money you can't spend.
Non-touchable.
Yeah, you can't touch it. Okay, and so when I look at this, I know that you said the top was more categories. I actually like having like one, and when I think about actual reserves, so I'm talking about this is a bank account, this is his name, and this is the money that makes it up. So for me, I like the idea like an operating reserve account, and that's what I call working capital. So from the district standpoint, during the first part of the year, we lose money because we're not selling water. So we have to have $1 million, $1.2 million, some amount to cover that shortfall. To me, in my mind, that's what that first line item is.
That's correct. You know,
Yep.
we originally called it working capital, which is the accounting side of it. That's what it is. There is a set number, which Bill and I have discussed, and Steve,
Like $2 million,
Ron and
isn't it?
Ross, and
Yeah.
went over the amount. But there's a range. It doesn't have to be that number
Yeah.
exactly. So the problem is when you get to these reserve policies, if you start saying, hey, here's the number, now every month I'm trying to hit that number and it's always going to go up and down. That becomes the issue where it's really a range. We can do it by percentage, which at the end of the day, it is a percentage of your operating. That's what we kind of want to go off of. That's the best way to say maybe there's a 10% range of what we're trying to hit. If it gets over a point, which I do that now, it's not really in our reserve policy, but it's just kind of a standard of policies that we do. When it hits to a certain point, I move the money over to our investment side and put that in where we get a higher interest rate. It doesn't need to be in our depository bank. If it gets too low, we can always transfer the money back over if we need to, but we're pretty good at, I wait till I know the income's coming in. You know, we have a big hit, which is taxes coming in. We usually, I think we're probably about 85 to 90% come January-ish, depending on each year, but somewhere around there. And then we obviously don't have our water revenue really coming in until summer starts coming, unless it's the summer like it is now. But we'll get to that point another time. But we kind of know what we need in there. So that is basically what that is. It's working capital or operating reserves, however you want to put it.
Yeah. And so the last thing, so the capital reserve, for me, I like that as a category, have those add up to create a target there. So that would be another line item or budget item that we have to do. Go to the next one, debt service reserves. Now, that's previously addressed in what you talked about previous, so we don't have to deal with that.
Yeah, that's a set number based on each time we go out for bond, and we budgeted. I'll know this budget's gonna be different than it was last budget, and what that number needs to be. And that's
Yeah.
something that
It's a
it's my
committed
job to make
reserve,
sure
yeah.
we put enough in there, and it's in there each month.
And so to me, that's almost redundant, because that's something we have to have anyway. And so if we set up a separate reserve for that, then to me, that would be redundant.
Well, there's a
unless-
separate
Redundant to
line now.
what?
It really, I mean, we can put in the reserve, it must meet standard quality, but I mean, it is something that needs to be, I think, we need to follow.
Yeah,
a
or we,
policy or
yeah,
follow-
but we wouldn't necessarily have to set a reserve account for that, because it's kind of already there.
Well, it's in a reserve account now.
Yeah.
I mean, we still do, we still have a
Yeah,
reserve account for
we
it.
still, I guess what I'm saying is, we don't necessarily have to, that's already done. So we may call it something different, but it's pretty much already there, correct? That debt service reserve.
It is it's what we still call it, that's what it is.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
so
in there
that's what I'm
right now.
saying. So that wouldn't be anything new. And then the
Wouldn't be
rate
anything new.
stabilization reserve. So that's essentially, if we have what we're going through now, which is a wet year, basically money to set aside to say, okay, we don't have to worry about
Raising rates.
raising rates.
And like I say, to me, the non-spendable reserves goes away. That's,
Yeah, yeah. I personally, I like the idea of if we have an operating reserve, the capital reserve, and then on the rate stabilization reserve, that's one where we're kind of getting into numbers, kind of what that number has to be. And I'm asking you to just come off the top of your head.
Okay.
The swing, I mean, what we're talking, $500,000, $750,000? Because to me, that's something, how do you calculate that? Because it
That's-
depends on,
That's really gonna be the direction of the board. I mean, we're working right now on the finance side to get us a good 5-year lookout on capital and what we're kind of going forward. Obviously predicting the weather, I mean, obviously we couldn't budget what this year is turning out to be right now. It's really up to the board and how we feel comfortable. We can do analysis and see what it's been over the last, 5, 10 years. But I think that really comes down to the direction. I mean, you get to a point where even though we have the money, I mean, we're kind of trying to, I hate to say shackle, but we're trying to limit ourselves what we should have percentage-wise in each one of these reserves. And you kind of get to a point where you're fine-tuning, like, hey, I don't want to have over 10% or whatever the number is, 5%, whatever that number you want to have there. And we're going to divvy it out to 6, 7, 8, 9, however many buckets we want to have. You're getting to that point, but I think to be comfortable, I mean, if we want to just set a number in a 5-year, this is where we want to hit in 5 years, that's kind of what we'd have. It'd almost be like an account that we really wouldn't spend. I think even we get to a point where we need to spend it, we can always move it from one reserve to the other and kind of balance them out each year. Something we would look at number-wise for each year as we go through the budget.
I think I can give you an answer to the rate stabilization reserves. Tracking the deviation or the delta between wet years and dry years over the last 10 years, and I do that every year.
okay,
We do that, we run about 10 to 16 on a wet year loss.
Percent?
Yeah, 10%, 10 to 16%. So what that boils down to is, in the other studies, somewhere I've read, let's just do somewhere I've read, they recommend having 2.5 to 3 years, because ordinarily what happens, you get into a wet cycle, and you will have 2 or 3 years of wet years. So what they're saying is you should have the ability to hold yourself for 2.5 or 3 years. Now, when I talk about hold yourself revenue-wise, and it's in this policy, we don't need to have a reserve to buy water from Fort Worth that we're not gonna buy.
And
to
we're
sell
not
it.
gonna sell, correct?
We don't need to pay for chemicals, and we don't need to pay for electricity, because all of those costs are going down. But what we do have to cover is the net between what we pay and what we sell it at, because we need that amount to cover our costs.
Do we know what that net is?
We do, actually, in your packet today,
Yeah.
we're gonna go over this a
Yeah.
little bit later on the finance side. I broke all this down, and we'll go into that to more detail. It's, obviously, right now, we're trailing, I'm gonna say about 15% is what we're trailing right now this year. But we're not talking about overall revenue of the whole budget. We're talking about 15% of just the water that's coming in the cells, and then the fees and everything else that kind of associates with the water cells and the monthly bills. So, when we say 15%, we're not saying it's gonna be
Yeah, not
15% of the
15% of
budget,
the
of the revenue
overall
coming in.
budget,
So-
we're talking 15%
Yeah,
of a
so,
budget.
I mean, we go from, just hypothetically here, you go from 1.5 revenue loss, or 1.5 million revenue loss, to now 500,000 revenue loss with the net difference.
That's the net difference you're gonna,
So
we're
Yeah.
gonna see
that's-
later. It's a
that's
half a
kinda
million
what you're
bucks.
looking at,
You're
so-
removing all your variable costs. and you-
Correct,
Yeah.
as best we can there, so that's kind of what we're tracking, kind of an ideal for there, but like I said, I think the best thing, we can look at it as a 5-year route, or however you want to do it, because it does trend together. If you look at last year and look at this year, we started out really bad last year. I mean, in summer it was horrible starting out this year, and we're still going forward now, 12 months almost in a cycle completely, so, it would be good to have a few years of recovery there, and what that comes out to, but.
Yeah. Did you have other?
Yeah, could we go back to the previous slide? I want to talk more about the shred out on these capital reserves, because they're important. That shred out's important. The rehabilitation and replacement reserves are for infrastructure, unplanned and accelerated infrastructure. The equipment replacement is strictly equipment, so you're talking about different things here. And then the emergency capital reserves is basically damaged by catastrophic events. So
Okay.
you're actually talking about literally 3 different things. And the last thing over here talks about single or multiple reserves, and this is clearly a multiple reserve categorization.
But I
Yeah.
think, Greg, your point, if I heard you correctly, is, yeah, this capital reserve is the big bucket, right? The
Yeah.
big category. It is funded, or should be funded, based on 3 different factors, the things you're talking about.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm an advocate still, and always have been, of not being so prescriptive that we have to put a number. We could put targets to that get to, when we have a number that's a capital reserve, let's pick a number, $3 million. When somebody says, well, how did you get that? Well, it's based on these factors. It's based on X here, X here, X here, that are targets. So he's not going crazy, or finance isn't moving money all around all the time.
You can build to that top, you can
Yeah,
build to
That's-
that top.
and so I think we're saying the same thing. So I agree with you. Those are 3 separate and distinct things, and they need to be calculated separately. The only thing I'm advocating is we have one reserve account that says capital reserves. The rehab and replacement may be 600,000. The equipment may be 400,000. The emergency cap could be 200,000. So we have, I don't know, what's that, 1.2, 1.3 in the account, and it's made up of those numbers. Now, in the emergency capital reserves, insurance, because a lot of that, when you talk about a catastrophic event, could be covered by insurance. And this is something I don't think has ever been discussed. Do we have all of our major equipment insured? So if we had a event where, a truck comes over and, or something is struck by lightning and takes out the plant, where we're not having to fund that, Are we transferring that risk via insurance?
Yeah, so we have TML, which is our insurance there. We have, we had to actually use it before when we had pumps were struck by lightning, and Carmen and I will sit down, and the department head will sit down and say, okay, let's look at this, because we're basically self-insured, so we're paying for this back at some point in time. Whether you pay for it today or you kind of take the risk out and you kind of pay for the increase in premiums as the years go by, which is normal insurance there. We talk about is it worth it depending on what the deductible is, what the cost of the equipment to replace it is. But we had used it before and had to to use it against replacing assets because they were struck by lightning and disasters happen. I believe flood is the only thing that's hard to do in this area, just based on where we live and how to do the flood insurance on that. But there are certain things that we can we is covered by TML. More emergency capital reserves is, I would say that maybe something has a 10-year life cycle that's supposed to last 10 more years left on the books, but all of a sudden something happened and it's just a faulty equipment that went down and it's past its warranty time. But yet on our books, we're still planning on 10 years before we replace it, and it goes down and it's a big pump or something that's major. Those are kind of things that, okay, now we need to take out a reserve. Should we have to turn around and replace it? Our replacement, we have categories right now. We call it, the way we call it now is the GASB reserves, which is infrastructure replacement, which we talked about before, having pull for the VFD pump, and we have actual capital assets that we replace on the life cycle time, which we put aside for each department to kind of go over different things that need to come up. So we kind of have these in a way now. We just haven't grouped them by these terminologies. We just do it a little bit differently.
Okay. And so what you described is different because, so knowing that, and with all insurance, you're basically paying for it. If I replace a roof on my house, my premium's going to go up. It's not going to be equal to the price of a new roof, but it's going to go up incrementally. So then that yes, sir?
We are effectively self-insured in that regard, so ours will go up that amount.
Okay, so
we're-
let me
we're
ask the question. So there's a lightning strike and it takes out one of the ground storage tanks, and let's say that thing costs $1 million to replace. We pay TML $50,000 a year. These numbers are all arbitrary and made up, so no one spaz out over it. So it takes out that ground storage tank and it's $1 million. So we file a claim and they paid $1 million. What will happen to our insurance the following year?
It gets financed over about a 3-year term, so they look at our last 3 years of loss history and set our policy accordingly.
And so
Yeah, there's
so
a
what
rate
you,
modifier.
so let me make sure I understand this. So that $1 million tank goes out. We're gonna assume, just to make it idiot-proof, nothing else has gone wrong over the previous 3 years. So they look back and say, okay, well, you paid 50, you had $1 million claim, we lost 850,000. So 3 into that. So we're gonna add $275,000 a year to your premium over the next 3 years.
I don't think it's quite that simple. I mean, it's just like a health insurance. If you have a self-funded plan, you're going to have highs, you're going to have lows in different times of the year. Taking all that in consideration, what the delta is that's there, there's a rate modifier, how risky you are to have other issues coming forward in the next 5 years or whatever it is. It's not, say we have $1 million and we're not going to turn around and see that $1 million hit our books next year. No, it's spread out a little bit differently, and it's like I said, it all takes consideration the net or the delta for everything.
Yeah, but I mean, for example, and what
I think you're right. In this particular case, the loss history determines the premium because we're self-insured on those types of things. We're just, basically TML is financing it on the back end. Now, when you have things like workers' comp insurance, right, that's a little different sort of a deal, but they still look at your claim history and go back and say, well, where do we set your premium now?
Yeah, but you two gentlemen are saying two dramatically different things. So if I have a heart attack and I go to Baylor
Vice President,
Grapevine,
I step up one.
yeah, you step up one, but let's say my bill is $300,000. My health insurance will go up, but I'm not going to pay that $300,000 over 3 years. It's going to go. It may go from $2,000 a month to $3,500, but they're not going to try to go back and recoup their loss. That's what I hear you saying. What I hear Carmen saying is they're going to come back and say, well, we paid out more than we received, so we're going to make that up over 3 years. That dramatically changes my view of that third bullet, which is the emergency capital. So which one of you guys are correct?
We have a funding that goes on with it, but as far as my understanding, from what I've seen in the past here and what we've done with TML, it's we technically could put ourselves outside. Like, if you have a health insurance, you could technically, your premiums are going to go up. You become now riskier, and you could put yourself where in a point where you can't get covered by the certain health insurance people, besides the people who go up the higher plan like that. We're not going to be a point where we're going to pay $1 million next year to make up for it. We have a self-funding on there, and we watch, the funding, it's a group funding. Everybody that's in TML puts money in, just like all these other insurance companies puts money in. They find out what the net is for all the people that are there. Some get riskier, some don't. And as far as my understanding, if we have too many claims, I believe we can be disqualified to have TML anymore, as far as my understanding how that works.
I think, Stephen, on equipment, we are our own pool. I just think it's that way. I think on workers' comp, we're a part of a bigger pool. But when it comes just down to little things like, bashing a truck into a wall, we're going to pay for that over a few years' time.
We've had claims before, and I've never seen the increase that much over the next year and like that. I mean, I can look into this and
Yeah,
find
so
out for sure. Going
so my
forward, but
request
I'm-
would be, one, can you find out definitively?
Sure.
And two, if Carmen is correct, can we look at just purchasing commercial insurance? Because essentially what that is, just emergency bank loan that we're financing over 3 years. That's not really insurance. So I would be interested in seeing if we can get true insurance. So it's based on claim history, but not where we're doing an emergency 3-year loan.
If I could add one thing to that, we're on the next agenda item, we're going to talk about some committees for the next couple. And one of them, as we go through the budget process every year, we're going to look at insurance premiums. That's something that gets budgeted. And we sit down with the TML folks every year. Stephen goes through it in detail, and there's different classes of stuff. We get to set our own deductible limits. I think we have very low deductibles on some of these things that probably don't make sense, given that we're actually experiencing our own loss experience. It gets financed over a period of time, so be happy to do that. If it's a thing like workers' comp, we've seen at least one bad accident here historically where a gentleman lost, I think, part of his leg in a incident related to a Vector truck. He just
He got cut across the chest
got across the chest.
with
perhaps.
pressure spray.
This is recent?
No, it's been the last 10 years, 10, 15 years.
Oh, it's prior to our board. Okay, I was about to say.
So, no, it was a big deal. It took a long time for that experience to go off of our workers' comp claim, right? But in workers' comp, we do participate as a part of a larger pool.
So-
I do think we need to go back and consider our deductibles, and
Yeah.
it goes hand in hand with the special purpose capital reserves.
Yeah.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, Greg, and everybody else, you're not saying we shouldn't have an emergency capital reserve. It's how do we get there? What's the proper number that we use to target, or how do we fund that
Yeah,
appropriately?
I think it should be
It's-
included into the capital
Okay,
reserve.
it's
but
just
we
a
need to-
matter of
Yeah, making sure
clarification of
how
okay.
we calculate that number.
It's a part of risk management.
Yeah.
I mean, that's effectively what you're doing.
So let me recap where I think I've heard us all. Operating reserves, yes. Capital reserves, yes. With kind of sub-accounts there that aren't specific. I mean, our targets laddering up to a capital reserve number. Debt reserve, yes. Rate stabilization, yes. And non-spendable, we're getting rid of.
Yeah, on the debt service reserve, I think we already have that, so I don't think we have to do anything there, other than unless we offer a definition, but based on what Stephen is saying, that's already set aside. It's
It's
part
the
of GAS
difference between
54.
committed, that's a committed reserve that you can't touch, right? When I had a chart one point in time 6 months ago that had a flow chart, which was committed reserves at the top, which you can't touch. So you go right next to the bottom, and it's still a reserve, but you can't touch it anyway.
Yeah,
The funding for that reserve is established.
okay.
It's established. All it does is put a title.
It's just called it a category.
It
Okay,
just
yeah.
brings it all together and says that's where it goes.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
And Stephen, one question which I think may be relevant to this is, when we discuss reserve funds, that doesn't necessarily mean there's gonna be separate bank accounts. It can be from a fund accounting perspective.
Yeah.
You can have a reserve fund, which is just paper accounting, but that reserve fund is not a separate bank or investment account. So this is really just an accounting classification,
yeah.
not number of bank or investment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Now, and some of our stuff that we do have, there is actually, obviously we have stuff that's in depository, like we have the savings account that goes in depository, some is investments. There are some of these that do have separate funds. For instance, the debt service reserves is a separate fund. It is completely by itself,
Yeah,
different bank
which I
account and
want to
everything.
keep that
There
way.
are certain things we do pull out separately. Well, we have the non-spendable there. That's technically in our bank account. If you look at our cash report and look at our bank account and say, hey, that money's in there. I just have it on our accounting side. Hey, we can't touch that. Let's pull that aside. These are the things I kind of, as Tony was saying, it's kind of hard when you say, hey, well, we got $7 million in the account that we should be able to spend that. Well, let me pull all this other stuff aside first, see what we really have that's it's sitting in it is spendable.
Yeah, and this is kind of outside of reserve. I really like to get away from that. I'd like to be able to clearly look and see this is reserve, not, well, give me an hour and a half and let me withdraw all this other stuff, and that 7 million is really $1.2 million. I think it
But that's
gives
what we're
a,
trying to accomplish. I mean, this gets
Yeah.
to that, right?
Yeah.
Well, so you have those stuff that kind of gets in the point too, where we have, like, for instance, now where we owed the MUD, the construction fund for the wastewater treatment plant owed the MUD $1 million in reserves. Technically, it's not in the account. It's, that account's negative in a way of looking at it, even though it's not truly negative, because we owed that money back to the MUD for that. If that makes sense there too.
Yeah,
So some of the
because
stuff gets
we
moved,
pre-funded something that we're gonna get refunded
Correct,
from this
correct.
bond issue.
So some of that, this kind of stuff that kind of comes across,
that's it.
we try to compare it back to the cash report, and that's kind of the avenue we were looking at to begin with. I think that's what put us off on the wrong trail, where we try to put all this stuff together. So
Yeah.
once we have a direction, and when we sat down and talked about, the committee did, our current reserve policy is 5 years is 50% of the highest over the last 5 years. We have 5 years to get there. Well, in reality, we're technically right there on that on that cusp being there this
Yeah.
year. But it doesn't break anything else out. Doesn't take out how that 50% gets associated with the
Yeah.
the operating side. So I think this is the right way to go. It just it's something like as Director Flynn was talking about. If we can do targets saying, hey, maybe once all that money's sitting in the pool, maybe once a year in September, October, how we kind of do it. This is where we're going to show how much we actually have in these areas and all these different reserve buckets that we have or percentage that we have. And then we can kind of show, okay, this is where we are. This is how long projectually we might take to get to these other percentages that we're looking for.
Yeah.
Okay, so, to be productive, in the packet, we have a draft.
Wait, before you get to that, Bill,
Okay.
I was gonna get that, but let me
Okay, go
summarize
ahead.
where I think we need to go as a subcommittee.
Okay.
If we're all kind of agreeing that we think we're on the right track now, Bill's right that he wrote a draft, which we're gonna have to have, a policy. I would suggest that we got to put some either numbers or targets, or, sharpen the pencil on just what we talked about, and at the next meeting, look at Bill's draft policy. That might have to be tweaked a little bit with what we talked about here, but in July, we need to finally approve this. I think that's where we're headed, right? I think we've got heads nodding on the buckets, so to speak, but now the policy behind it, which is out there, is kind of the meat and potatoes behind that.
Yeah.
And kind of on the other side of the coin where Steve's at, I would like to press ahead at this point, because we need to lock in what we're doing here, one, and that the funding mechanism, the funding period is budget, but the determination of each one of these categories and the percentages is something that can all follow on either as additional line items in this, added to this particular document, or it can be a separate standalone document in itself, which could be adjusted every year, and then this document stays the same, and you do, in the budget process, you set the reserves, and when you adopt the budget, you adopt the reserves number. Do it that way. Those numbers don't need to be in this particular document, is my point.
Yeah, I don't think we put, unless you put and I don't think we're at the point of doing a calculation. I think you describe what these are made of.
Yep.
And then I think we need Mr. Stephen to go back and do some of the analysis and come back to say, this is what I think it ought to be, and then we can have that conversation. Yeah, that smells right, or tweak this, move that, do this, do that.
Okay, so I have, first of all, I found a couple of errors in the draft. verbiage that I'd like to correct. I can probably do this in about 4 motions, and then we'd have this done tonight with the understanding that the numbers are not resolved. The numbers would be either another document, or after budgeting gets through, we come back and we add individual lines on each one of these and say what the targets
I'm
are.
an advocate, just let me weigh in as the director side of putting, if we don't have numbers now, I get that. But having this document have the numbers, I don't want to have a sub-document.
We can do it 2 ways.
That cross-references this document. We can approve what we're talking about here, but,
I've seen them
I
both
mean,
ways.
at the budget processing, maybe that's the point where we do this every year, but we have hard and fast numbers that's in the document.
I've
That's
seen
my
them,
vote.
I've seen, I think you too, because we've
Yeah.
exchanged documents.
Are we
I've
done
seen them
looking
where
at
it
this,
does that.
guys? Do we need to look at this anymore?
I don't,
Can I sit down is what I'm getting at.
we don't need to look at it more, but I appreciate if you stood up longer.
So, I mean, if the board would like to proceed, then I'll go ahead and set the motions in, and I can talk you through the document and explain where the parts of the document came from. And if you don't like the way it's going, you can always say move to table it, and it's tabled.
So are we talking about the June 17th, 20?
Well, that's,
Oh,
it
well.
starts on page 41.
Bill,
But-
can I ask a
Sure.
question which may or may not be relevant? It appears to me that in each of these reserve funds, you've also addressed the GM's expenditure authority with respect to those monies,
Yes,
and
that's all.
separately have a resolution that addresses the GM's expenditure authority. And I'll ask the question whether we want to have 2 different documents that address the same issue, or would you like to try to wrap the authority into one document so we have one source to look to? Because we often end up discussing whether or not the GM has expenditure authority, and I'm just wondering
If there's a conflict.
having it
Well,
to look
have,
to 2 different
yeah.
sources.
to have, I understand your point. And the point is actually a tad bit, the picture's a tad bit larger. The picture is, we may have several individual documents rather than having one financial policy in which all of those documents are brought together and collated to ensure that there are no conflicts. Okay? Did that make sense?
No.
No, okay. Got,
Yeah, it
I
makes
build,
sense to me.
I build a document here, and I build a document over there, and I say over here the GM can do 10%, and I say over here the GM can do 15%.
Exactly.
That's a conflict. And the reason a conflict exists is because the 2 different documents were built at different times, and there wasn't the sufficient research done to determine that there was A, a conflict, and B, there was no effort because there was no knowledge to correct that conflict. Okay?
So that's what Tony's point is, if I hear him.
Yeah.
Having a document, a single source document that addresses that.
But see, the issue is, this is a reserve policy, and the other one is perhaps in his contract even?
So I'll
Yeah,
try to
do it.
give you an example.
Do it.
So this states that, I'm looking at the
Yep. Because they do.
emergency capital reserve, but I think the point is this equipment replacement reserve
Okay.
is authorized to
What
approve it.
section are you? Do me a favor.
I think it's B3 on page 47. Is that what you're looking at, Tony?
I guess
Yeah,
if there's a
okay.
dollar amount in one policy and there's not a dollar amount in this policy, what do we do?
Yeah.
Okay, in this case, well, when you pass a budget, those expenditures are authorized, correct?
They're budgeted.
Yeah, they're budgeted.
But he couldn't do it. So let's say we said we're gonna replace the water system. It was $6 million. He couldn't just go in between meetings and sign a contract for $6 million,
Because it
just because we
exceeded-
budgeted.
yeah.
Yeah, because it exceeded his expenditure. So I agree with Tony that this would indicate, as long as there's a reserve and it met the requirement, he could go spend the money.
Okay, well, this in a way is, this is, because it's categorized, or Okay, because it says the general manager is authorized to approve the expenditure of equipment replacement reserves without prior approval of the board of directors in accordance with approved policy and budget authorizations. So that turns around and puts the other document back into play.
But then the question would be, what value does it even have it to say here if that's driving his behavior?
Okay, the reason it's here is because when you do one of these documents, there are certain things that need to be in each item. One of those items is who's authorized to expend it.
In my mind, the purpose of this document would be to classify the district funds and to designate any reserves that we have, including funding priorities and goals, so that then ultimately the financial statements will reflect this, so that if we have $7 million, the public's gonna understand that doesn't mean we have $7 million to spend. $5 million is committed to X, Y, Z, or reserves. And that's in large part the purpose of GASB 54 and this document. In my mind, who is authorized to expend funds is really a different issue, and I'm concerned we may unnecessarily be creating conflict or confusion by having multiple documents address expenditure authority. And does it really need to be in the same document that establishes and classifies funds?
Well, the reason it's here is because the guidance indicated that it should be. Said it should look at, each one should have, and I'm not,
But I suspect
Yeah,
that
I think-
guidance
I think
didn't
that's
contemplate.
Right, that
having
it,
a
that
separate-
existed somewhere else.
Yeah.
that's a GFOA
Yeah.
standard.
And if we want to get rid of the other document and only address it here, we can have that discussion,
don't-
but.
I
my point
wouldn't
is
want to do that. I would be an advocate of pulling this out because to me, this doesn't add any value. To me, I truly see this as, this tells me how much money we have to have set aside and what those funds are used for. The fact that the general manager is authorized to approve expenditure, that should be addressed somewhere else. This, a reserve policy, not a authorization for expenditure policy.
But each one of these categories have an authorization. Every one of those has an authorization. If you start at the top, operating reserves. The general manager, one board director, or two board directors are authorized to approve the expenditure. Who can sign a check?
So even if we say we want to specify expenditure authorization for each category, would it not make more sense to pull that out and drop it into the other document?
No.
Let me ask you a question. So if we set a reserve policy without putting who's authorized to do it, ultimately, the board is gonna authorize the expenditure of that amount. And so how would us spending the money that's in the reserve be any different from if we spent money that was not in the reserve? Other than when we make the motion, we have to specifically call
Well,
out where the funds have been
I don't
expended
think-
from.
I agree. I think under this language, the board may not ultimately make the decision. We are delegating authority.
Exactly.
And I'm not sure if we all want to do that, or we want to do it in a way which may be different than the other policy that we have.
So, looking at the operating reserves. Okay, you have an operating reserve called in working capital right now.
Okay.
The fellow over on the left writes the checks, but he cannot sign the checks. Takes a general manager and a director, or two directors, to sign the checks. Okay?
Okay.
So that is C, that is 302C.
So I guess my question would be,
Well, some of that statement is not quite accurate, I guess I would say. Okay, so technically, I have the authority to write the check. So and on the working capital side, if it's within my budget limit, Carmen actually doesn't have to get involved at all. I have the authority to go if it's within the budget, and under my authority, I have the ability to actually agree with the funds, even though I can't sign the check. I still agree with the funds and write them out. I have the ability to do that.
Yeah, you put the dollar.
Mike has the ability for his department to say, hey, I need to get this and this, it's under our authority. I can go ahead and load it, cut it, and it's ready to go.
But you cannot sign the check. So ultimately,
Correct. But I do have the ability to actually agree that it gets written, that it's ready to go.
yes, but bottom line, you don't get to sign the check.
So let me ask you a question, because this is implying that, based on what I'm hearing, the district could not have functioned before this policy was written. We've moved money, we've paid bills, we've paid things out of reserve, we've done everything, and this policy has never existed, which means that this is addressed somewhere else.
This is really, honestly, this is addressed under GASB 54. GASB 54 actually shows, depending on their restrictions, who has the authority to, stuff that is legally bound. Carmen, like the debt reserve policy, which is under GASB 54, he doesn't have the ability to move that money. He actually goes to the board because it is legally bound that we have to set it aside. That kind of makes a difference. I think that's where we are, is we're still putting GASB 54 in with our reserve policy and kind of blending them together in a way. I think that's, from my understanding, that's kind of what direction we're going.
This document very much blends the two.
Right.
And I thought the purpose of this was not to blend the two.
Well, I think the very first part of the document, it shows the definitions, and I think that's good. But when we get to the reserve side of it, I think we could do away, as you say, with that, if we're trying to look at percentage and everything. Because it comes to a point where then and every time we need to move percentage, I need to get a board's authority to move money that's in our working side. I think that becomes the issue we're running into, isn't it?
Yeah,
That's the issue we don't want to.
That's the issue I don't want to run
Right.
into.
Right, I understand.
And
but
I
it's
don't think we have that with the way this is written.
Can I unless there's some urgency, is there any way we can?
Yeah, I'd say
discuss
let's
this more at
table
the
this and
committee level?
deal with it.
I think that this is the first
I
time
mean,
a lot
the whole idea, guys, was, right, to simplify the process from when we talked 2 months ago.
Yeah.
I think we accomplished that when we looked at the slides and the buckets and everything. I think we ought to take that same approach in the written document to the extent that you can, be detailed enough, but yet not overly complicated.
Yeah, to me, ultimately, before anyone is spending any money, and short of within their spending authority, it comes back to the board to authorize. And so I question, why do we need to have some of these terms in here? It just doesn't make sense to me unless I'm missing something, because based on what I'm hearing, we should have been dead in the water for the last 20, 30, 40 years because this policy didn't exist.
Well, part of this policy is still in our current policy, which is the definitions is still in. It still refers back to GASB. So therefore, we fell under that category, falling back to what the rules and regulations are for GASB.
Article 2, by and large, Article 2 of this document, by and large, is a prior order, and it's carried in the whereases. And I can talk to that too.
Yeah, I say, well, let's table this. I don't want to spend another hour talking about this. I mean, I think it's something we need to get through, but this seemed like it's duplicating things that's already there, and I don't want to do that.
Tony, what was your suggestion? It sounded like you were heading toward a suggestion or not.
Well, I
Maybe.
was gonna, I think I'm hearing board support for the fund classifications that you guys have put together. And so, to me, the outstanding issues that perhaps the committee can focus on is this expenditure issue and whether it should be in here or not, and we can have a more substantive discussion. And then secondly, the funding targets and goals for the different reserve funds / classifications, and bring back recommendations to the board regarding both of those items.
Makes sense to me.
Did you want to address the spending authority?
But that was one of the items.
Okay, because that is a GFOA item.
Are we, I guess for me, GFOA, that's a,
Government Finance Officers Association.
so to me, if they're not binding on us, I honestly, they have
Oh, it's not
opinion along
It's
with.
a guideline.
It's a guideline. I mean,
Yeah,
And substantially, I'm not opposed to making sure it's clear what is the expenditure authority of individuals with respect to the different funds you take.
okay.
My concern is more about having separate
Conflict.
policies, and I think there are potential conflicts
Okay.
between those, and I think we should be clear.
So we need to check for conflicts.
Yes, and I think talk about whether we really want to have people have to look to two different documents to determine whether or not there's expenditure authority in place for a given expenditure.
We need, yeah.
Okay, I think we've got the marching orders.
Yeah.
Bring it back next meeting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. No,
We'll table it, committee to work on it, bring it back next meeting.
yeah. Item number 6, discuss and possible action to appoint 2 directors to serve on the budget committee to work with staff on the draft budget for fiscal year 2020.
Mr. President, I am aware that we brought this to the board last year and it met with resounding defeat. But I put it back on this year because I still think it's a good idea to have a budget subcommittee to help us work through that kind of detailed process. For example, when we get down to talking about, you know, where we are relative to our projected water sales for the year, that's an upcoming item. The one page in our budget had so much detail in the water projection for what we're going to sell that it was impossible to reproduce on a piece of paper that certainly anybody my age could look at without a magnifying glass. So kind of going through and hearing from the staff what details have gone into that, you know, looking at some things like the benefits analysis that they go through, looking at new benefits for the year. We feel like it would be beneficial to have a budget subcommittee work with us. If the board wants to have us bring the whole budget back to the board and go through it in detail, we will. But we took this opportunity to ask that you appoint a budget subcommittee to work with the staff on the development of the budget.
I'm willing to play on that committee, but I also would anticipate to bring discussion and documents back for the entire board so that they be knowledgeable in the entire.
I would like to offer up a suggestion that as we discuss number 6 and number 7, I know they're separate items, but we're talking about volunteerism in both cases, right? So I'd like to suggest that we all play in one or two of those and not, you know, we got to spread the wealth here.
The staff discussed this item as well. We are willing to meet for these committee meetings at, say, 6 o'clock at night, so we're not excluding those of us who are still working for a living.
I would say, just my experience, I've served on the rate committee the last couple of times. It's to the point to where it's not overly burdensome because you're not looking at 30,000 scenarios like we've done in previous time. It's much more simplistic. So I've met, when we've done it, we did, I think, a 3-hour meeting, and it didn't last that long because it was.
Just keep doing what we're doing.
Yeah, so I don't personally, I know I've served on in the past, I don't have any problem with meeting during the week. I think the only other person that would be severely impacted by it if it met during business hours would be Director Chapman. 1, I don't know if he has a desire to serve on it, and 2, if he did, whether or not he'd be willing to sacrifice an afternoon to do it.
If we can do it at after hours, I can do it.
So, given that there's 4 of these, I guess, is there somebody who do not want to serve on any of them?
I do not.
Okay.
Big surprise.
I move that Kelly's on both of them.
I think to round out her experience as a board member, that would be, I like that suggestion, both of them, yeah.
Okay, and right after that, we'll accept her resignation, as she says. Yeah.
I don't think this will impact the board's process, but just, and not to jump ahead too much, but one of the bills that was passed by the legislature, Senate Bill 2, will impact the tax, will impose new limitations on the district with respect to its tax rate, and there's a lot more information that has to be prepared and attached to the budget. Steve and I haven't talked about this yet, but depending on what the district does, there's going to be some new requirements. I don't think it impacts this committee process, but there's going to be, particularly at the staff level, some additional work and steps that have to be undertaken this year.
Okay. Yeah. So was it Bill, who was on the rate last time? Was it you and I?
No,
Or was it me and,
You and Flynn, I believe.
it was you? I would say, one of us, I would recommend one of us stay on it. Just so you have to dump two new people on the rate committee, I think wouldn't be a great idea.
If you want to stay on it, I'll do the budget one with Bill. And then you have,
I'll do the
do the rate.
Okay.
The other,
You're welcome.
as long as we.
So, and where that's relevant is if,
We're gonna get you one of these days.
so if, for instance, the board wanted to generate additional revenues but not be subject to the rollback election requirement, it's foreseeable that you would then shift some of this into the form of rates differently than you would have in prior years. So that's a possible scenario, depending on your budget.
Yeah, and so that kind of brings up, and we're kind of blending into 6 and 7, but one of the things that Bill and I talked about previous years, which made absolutely positively no sense, is we would do rates and then do the budget, which seems backwards. So this seems like a great year.
we're not doing that.
Well, we've done it in past years, where we've done the rates and then budget.
There's kind of a difference here. So in the past years, the way it gets approved is that way, or the way you basically present it. The budget doesn't get adopted till obviously, right, at the very last minute here. Obviously, we go out for a hearing and everything else so the public knows. We have to go at least a meeting before to understand what rates we're going to be looking at, what scenarios we need, and then we can go forward with the budget and get that adopted. As far as the meeting goes, the budget committee would, if we do a budget committee, would meet first. We would probably have 2 meetings before we actually have the rate committee step up and actually do a meeting. There's usually, last year was the first year that I know that we didn't actually have a budget committee. So the staff had several meetings prior to the board even seeing it. And then we had, I believe, 2, maybe 3 special meetings last year to make up, to kind of let the board know as we went along for budget workshops.
Had meetings so far, staff's had meetings. Okay.
So,
I'd
in
be
the way,
disappointed
if you look at, you're kind of approving, or not really adopting, but approving rates before you're approving the budget, adopting the budget, but in reality, there's a lot of work prior to you get to the point of the rates.
Yeah, which is fine.
I consider what you're saying is you have a rate process, and you agree to a rate process, and then we get the budget, and we see where we're at on budget, and then if we need to adjust the rates to fit the budget, then we make that adjustment.
Correct, and then you adopt it all. So right now, we've actually, at the staff level, we've got the rates going at the same time as we have the budget going. So
Well,
we don't even
sure,
have a budget
sure.
built yet, but we have a rate already starting, and we're doing the rate model, getting that going with New Gen. So it's a parallel process, but then again, we kind of slow down for one step, the next one steps in, and then we kind of, it's
Yeah.
a lot back and forth.
When you
between
get the
both of them.
budget, when you get the big budget number, you just plug it back in over here on rates and say, now watch it flow through to what it does with the rates.
Correct.
Well, given this new information of 2 or 3 budget meetings, I would like to amend my proposal. Well, Mr. Wilson and I will flip-flop. You get to go to 3 meetings. I'll stay on the budget. Just it's a joke. Just roll with me, will you?
Oh, yeah, I'm highly offended.
Oh, all right.
So,
Follow me out the
With
door.
that,
But you can't be fired.
I can abdicate the throne. Okay, so I'll entertain a motion for 6. Let's not all speak at once. She's gonna do it. Yeah.
yeah.
I'd like to make a motion to appoint 2 directors to serve on the Budget Committee to work with staff on the draft budget for fiscal year 2020, Director Flynn and Director Rose.
Okay, we have a motion by Director Castanway to appoint Secretary Treasurer Flynn and Vice President Rose to serve on the Budget Committee for the 2020 fiscal year budget. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Second by Director Chapman. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor indicate by raising your hand.
Since I volunteered up front, I have to vote for, otherwise I was gonna abstain, but since I volunteered, so.
Okay, motion passes unanimously. Item number 7, consider and take appropriate action to appoint 2 directors to serve on the rate committee to work with staff to review and develop recommendation regarding water and sewer rates for fiscal year 2020.
All right, I'd like to make a motion to appoint 2 directors to serve on the rate committee to work with staff to review and develop recommendations regarding water and sewer rates for fiscal year 2020. President Wilson and Director Chapman.
I see she has some Bill Rose in her.
Yeah, but she said she'd like to make a motion.
Yeah,
Oh,
I move.
I
That's all it-
motion.
There you go.
Yes.
I move.
okay. Director Caswell moved. Okay. We have a motion to appoint President Wilson and Director Chapman to serve on the rate committee to work with staff to develop the water and sewer rates for fiscal year 2020. And it's seconded by,
I'll second.
seconded by Secretary Treasurer Flynn. Any discussion?
Kelly, you want to reconsider? Okay, no discussion.
All right, hear none. All in favor indicate by raising your hand. Motion passes. Do you have a snide remark there that you want to get in? No. Okay.
I got plenty of them.
I know you do.
Okay, number 8, discussion and possible action regarding district organization structure planning, including planning for future general manager services. This was an item that Secretary Treasurer Flynn and I brought forward. This is not a unilateral replacement to Carmen, but recognizing that he has desire to go and live a fruitful life outside of the Trophy Club Bud. And so it's diligent on our part to start to plan to get a replacement in place for him and have a reasonable transition period, so we can have a smooth transition, even though a majority of the more difficult issues he's addressed in his tenure with us, so that makes this a whole lot easier than it would have been a year or two ago. So that's the purpose of this item. I'd like to give Carmen an opportunity to maybe share his vision on kind of timing and when he thinks maybe he will be ready to transition out the district. So we'll kind of have a feeling officially for our timing for these actions.
Thank you, Mr. President. I guess just as a general proposition, I'm hopeful to follow in Director Flynn's footsteps and have my retirement be an epic failure as well.
True.
I think that's what you called it, right?
It is.
It's an epic failure.
Yeah.
You're just doing more stuff now than you did when you were working. So I can tell, I've told some of the board, but I can tell you all and do it on camera, that the shortest period of time I'll be with the district is 30 days. and
For contract.
the longest is really about the end of March, start of April of 2020. I'd like to be on my way by then. So to whatever extent we need to have some overlap time, I'm perfectly good with phasing out over those last few months, just in terms of hours per week committed. But I've been looking at spending a month abroad next April, middle April into middle May, perhaps.
Hey, Greg, you and I talked about this, and Carmen talked about this. I'm a big advocate from my business background, as you all are, on succession planning, and that's why this has come up. I mean, we have kind of known that at some point in time, unfortunately, that Carmen is going to move on. He's done a spectacular job, but that doesn't change the fact that it's going to happen. And so we as a board, it's our obligation, I think, to work with Carmen to help, to whatever extent we'll find, find the successor, whatever that process is, but then make that transition from a cross-training. It's just good business.
Yeah.
So I think now's the time to really get moving on it.
So I think the last job description that was in place, I think, was appropriate. And so I know the first, it took a lot longer for the first search than we anticipated. And we were fortunate that Carmen came available. So when the second one was developing, that was a rather smooth transition. I don't think we can count on being as fortunate on this one, so my recommendation would be that we get started, figure out kind of how we want to go about doing this. I agree that I think we need to have a period of transition. I would like to do at least 3 months, so get someone in place by the end of the year, so we can do a transition. Kind of stuck in a rock and a hard place, because if you start early, you find someone the next month, then you're kind of like, nope. Or if you start later and you don't find someone, you're like, nope, nope. So, I think it's a good time to, one, look at job description, make sure everyone's comfortable. And then I think the bigger things we have to figure out is approach.
Yeah.
Do we want to, last time we selected a number of recruiters that honestly bore no fruit. We posted, I think, Director Thomas, former Director Thomas at that time had a relationship with AWBD, and that brought in a number of candidates as well. So I think we have to figure that piece out. Obviously, we take recommendations from staff and counselor if they're ones that are known. And so I think probably one of the biggest things we have to decide is when it comes to recruiters, there are retained recruiters, ones that you pay in advance. I'm not an advocate for those. I'd rather contingent recruiter, which is someone you pay up on a placement. So I would recommend that we go purely look at contingent recruiters for this space and not go with any retained recruiters. And then take a look at the job description and put it out with AWBD and the other organizations where people of this caliber would look out.
And I asked Carmen this question before, is there on the headhunter, recruiter front, experts in the area of public service, you know, there are certain groups that focus on that more so than business necessarily?
There's certainly, well, the SGR, Strategic Government Resources, does a lot of executive position for local governments, and that would include water districts to some extent. You know, so they would be one on the list. I probably have a couple of others that I could get the name for, and we could inquire of them. The job description for the general manager was updated when we went through the salary survey here about 18 months ago, roughly.
That long?
No,
Well,
it wasn't that long.
on board.
Yeah,
We were on board, so it was last
last
year.
all right. Well, I'm suffering from time compression, as is the mayor of the town. He said he'd been in the town hall for, I think, over 2 years now, is what he mentioned in his State of the Town address. And I know I've only sent in like 22 invoices, and the town was still in this building when I showed up. So not quite 2 years yet on the town. So maybe that's just what happens when you get older. You suffer from time compression. We can certainly get you some information like that. I would point out to y'all that our industry in particular is really suffering from what I'm going to call a demographic hangover. Where, you know, we get these dips and valleys in the demographic curve, and we often, just looking across water industries in general, have a graying workforce. I think Steve was, we were in his golf cart when we met one of the gentlemen at the plant. He's been working in sewer treatment since 1978. I think our average age of person at the wastewater plant is probably north of 40. I'm going to say north of 50. That's the average age, and the youngest person there is probably our manager, Frank. So, you know, what you're going to look for, I guess, is also going to be a question, right? Hopefully people will have some knowledge of Safe Drinking Water Act, Clean Water Act in the process.
That would be helpful.
It could be useful. I think, you know, there's some argument that you need an engineer. Now, that said, you can get by without that. You can hire that service in. But it's, you know, it's certainly one of the open questions, right? We're going to be involved in pipeline replacements for the next 2 decades. And on both the water and sewer side, we're going to be engaging engineers to do rehab and replacement designs for water, sewer infrastructure. Probably not anything as big as the wastewater plant project, but more projects. So, I would argue that someone with a real strong background in utilities or even public works, who just has a Master of Public Administration, who knows kind of the backside of working with local governments, which we're one, that could be helpful as well. So, it doesn't have to be a technical person per se, but
at the risk of kicking this down the road, which I know we're not doing, but time is of the essence to some degree. I would propose that maybe we try to put together a timeline of certain events, and I'd be happy to take a kick at that. Get the resume together, get 30 days out, 60 days out, 90 days out, so that we're kind of keep on track with that. Otherwise, it's going to be August and September, and we're kind of still talking about it.
Yeah, I agree with you.
I concur.
I think we need to appoint a person. Last time we went through this process, we had two people who kind of did the nuts and bolts that was directed by the board to push the process forward, so we weren't hamstrung with only having a meeting to do things. I think that would be the best approach to allow movement to continue. And then they come back and give the board updates on that, because, for example, once we get the names of those organizations, then we have to reach out and get contracts. Now, obviously, the board would have to approve the contracts, but if we leave it the way it is, Carmen comes back with the names, then we have to say yes to those names, then go out and get the contracts, and now we're 2 meetings down versus if we appoint a couple of people to kind of work together, we can drive a lot of that stuff to where we can make a decision or have maybe something to sign when we get to the next meeting. That would be my recommendation.
I have a alternate recommendation. Well, it's not alternate. I would be happy to do that with one caveat. That my partner is Kelly. So she can help me along this process. It's something we can work together with, I think we. Kelly?
Second
Not?
and third that.
I love it.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll make a motion that we grant Secretary Treasurer Flynn and Director Castanway the authority to work with staff and any means possible to identify recruiters and start the initial discussions, but ultimately, between now and the next meeting, we'll authorize them to go forward with the goal, by the time we make it to the next meeting, that we have arrangements in place to review and possibly initiate.
Yeah, I mean, by the next meeting, I think we can put together a timeline, which is a working timeline that we all can agree on, and let's get after it.
That was a long motion, but I'm going to second it.
I learned from the best. Any discussion?
On your contingency recruiting, do you typically have like I don't want to say it, because I'm used to the recruiter doesn't get his money till the person has been in place for 30, 60.
Yeah, most of them are such, where it's either 90 or 60 days, or some period of time afterwards before they're paid.
So we don't get a bounce.
Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that.
But that would be an agreement that ultimately we sign, so if it's a term that the board's uncomfortable with, then we would strike that. And we have our attorney extraordinaire down there, wouldn't dare let something like that slip through the cracks.
Do they typically go like 10, I think you're a 1099, right?
I'm a 1099.
Yeah, the goal would be, unless we ended up in another rare exception, be to find a permanent employee rather than another contractor.
Okay,
I would
so we're going
concur with that.
Yeah, the goal would be to find an employee.
FTE type
Yes.
instead of a W-2 or a 1099. Okay.
Correct.
That's fine. That's the end of
That
mine.
would be a board vote, but.
Yeah, obviously, that's my preference, but the board obviously can go a different direction. Any other discussion? Hearing none, all in favor indicate by raising your hand. Motion passes unanimously. Okay, item number 9, presentation from legal counsel regarding terms and conditions of the 2016 interlocal agreement with the Town of Traffic Club related to Fire Department funding and operations. Mr. Corbett.
Carmen and I spoke about, and we had a conference call with Stephen and I think Lori, in connection with the annual fire department budget and funding process. In the course of that discussion, I think we concurred that it might be helpful to the new board directors for me to provide a very brief overview of the interlocal agreement that's in place with the town of Trophy Club that addresses the budget and funding and responsibilities of the two respective entities in connection with fire and emergency services. So that was really the purpose of this item. We're approaching that time of year where this process is starting. So again, it's to provide you with a brief background information so that you'll be familiar with the steps and actions required by the district in the next couple of months. There's a copy of the ILA in your board packets. I'm just going to try to hit some of the highlights that I think are relevant for you without going into too much detail. The first would just be the term of the agreement in section 1.2. It's a 5-year agreement. It expires September 30th of 2021. It automatically renews unless it's notice of non-renewal is given, but again, there's a couple of years left, and I think that's important to keep in mind in connection with future planning. Article 3 relates to budget and funding process. The agreement states that the town shall develop a draft budget for the fire department, and it's supposed to be furnished to the two entities for approval before August 1st of each year, and that the parties will adopt the budget before August 15th of each year. The agreement doesn't really address what happens if the parties don't agree, but again, just we're approaching that season where this budget, I'm sure it's in the process of being developed by the town now, and will be presented to you, and there's that joint meeting for the two entities to discuss it and hopefully approve it. With respect to funding, Section B there in 3.1 addresses the parties' relative funding obligations. The first item is that the district shall fund 50% of the cost of personnel. This agreement specifies the source of funding for each of the cost categories, and that it provides that the district would fund its 50% share with the fire tax. The next category is services and supplies, and the agreement obligates the district to fund 100% of those costs, again, to be funded out of the fire tax. Next category is capital replacement costs. Again, the district would fund 100% of those costs with its fire tax. And then the town will fund a share of cost associated with provision of service to the PID area, since that's outside the district's taxing jurisdiction, and they would fund their share with PID assessments. And the district under Section 5 on the next page is obligated to continue to pay debt service on its outstanding debt related to the fire department and fire equipment. Subsection 6 there provides that overages and shortages shall be applied proportionally. So this is really a true-up concept. Stephen and I had a discussion about that, and I think this true-up mechanism may be more complicated and harder to administer than if a check was just written for true-up purposes. So there's a few cleanup changes that we would recommend to reflect kind of the actual practice of how this works versus what's on paper. And I believe that's one of them that would make Stephen's job easier. So keep that in mind as an item. Again, rather than apply a true-up and offset to the monthly payment obligations that the month would otherwise do in installments, this contract contemplated that an overpayment in 1 year would be credited and would reduce the monthly payments for true-up purposes. I think it's actually easier from an accounting perspective for both parties, is my understanding, if just a check was
Yeah.
written.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it really is not just to make my job easier, but it makes it, to me, it makes it more transparent and cleaner for everybody to understand what came in, and we're not reducing things down dollars here and there to make up for it.
It's a one-time check, so.
Right, it's an adjustment
And
of,
that's what we currently do right now, for the PID assessment, so, I'm sorry, the PID surcharge, so it'd be in line with how we do another ILA that we have currently too.
And I think another comment that's been received is perhaps, rather than specify the source of funding, let the governing body of the district determine its funding, source of funding for its payment obligations. And again, paragraph C there on page 3 provides that the district's funding would occur in 12 monthly installments that correspond to the fiscal year, based on the mutually approved budget. Article 4 just addresses the parties' respective obligations. You'll see in 4.2 that the town is responsible for providing the actual fire protection services and oversees the daily operations associated with those services.
Tony, could I touch on that one briefly? You mentioned the one previously about the finances and how they're determined, we're limited to taxes. As Tony mentioned, I'm an advocate, I think, of at least considering removing that restriction in case we want to go to a different funding system for it. We'd at least have the latitude. As currently outlined, we don't have the latitude. On this particular one,
Which section are you looking
I'm 4.2A. Responsible providing fire protection services to eligible persons. Eligible persons, I believe, is under 2.1A, means Westlake. And I understand there's some issues about,
No, I don't think that's right.
well, check 2 what did I say, 2.1? The definition of eligible, 2.1A, eligible persons.
What page are you on?
I'm going to be on page 51. Eligible persons residing, traveling within, or being physically located within the corporate boundaries of the town of Trophy Club, Texas, and/or district.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I thought you just said it was only Westlake.
No, there's a,
Yeah, that's
well,
what I
there is,
heard as well.
there is the issue is, I understand, to put it nicely, we're persona non grata with our fire department in Westlake.
With Westlake's fire department.
With Westlake, yeah. My understanding is they don't want our fire department over there. So I don't know whether that's something that we can, they answer under automatic aid, they will answer under mutual aid, but if an alarm comes in, it goes through a different call system, goes through Keller, doesn't come in through our call system. Our guys, our fire department doesn't know about it unless they call us. So I don't know if I'm holding the town's feet to something that they can't do.
I
You're
don't think so.
confused. Okay.
And I don't want to stray too far
Okay.
tonight.
Okay,
But the district's corporate boundaries, where it levies a tax for purposes including for fire protection services, are obviously defined.
yes,
And the town of Westlake had a very large part in defining those boundaries. Specifically, Westlake
yes,
agreed that our boundaries would include the town of Westlake. Those property owners there pay tax to the district for fire protection services. The district owns and operates hydrants and other equipment over there. And
they're tied to our lines.
and they pay taxes to make it available there. The fact that Westlake chose to become the first responder doesn't, in my opinion, impact or lessen our obligation to make services available to our taxpayers, and in accordance with our fire plan, we have agreed to make it available. Again, the fact that the telephones are programmed in a way to determine who gets called first doesn't change
The
our
fact-
obligation or,
Okay, so we've made it available, whether they use it or not, is there.
Westlake chose to reprogram the phones in a way that they got called first. That was their discretion, but we still have our statutory obligations, which we continue to meet.
Yeah, to me, that's the equivalent of NISD has to provide educational services to students in their district. You can opt to homeschool your child, but they still have the obligation to provide if you choose to take advantage
And
of
in
it.
every territory, there's one primary responder, and it's
Yeah.
kind of, and
So So you would say we're good.
Absolutely.
Cool. Okay.
Otherwise, we're levying a tax on folks who aren't
Right.
getting services, so
Yeah.
I think it's important.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Sure. Article 5 is just ownership of assets, essentially provides that each entity owns the assets that it funds. Article 6 is employee matters, that the employees in the fire department are town employees and work in accordance with the town's personnel policies and benefits. And most of the other provisions are really, I'll call legal boilerplate, but we just wanted the new board members to have that kind of general background in connection with the budget process that's about to commence.
So is this something, Tony, that has to be, this document agreed upon by the town?
Has to be what?
Is the town?
It's already in place.
If we change it, yes.
He's just, no, we're not changing it. He's just making the new board members aware of what the agreement says.
Okay.
So when the budget comes along, when you're approving the budget, you'll
changing
know
it.
kind of what's driving that.
Yeah, and I think it's possible, in the context of joint discussions with the town, we've identified a couple of potential revisions. It's possible the town also has some that they may identify. I think it's possible there could also be some longer-term, bigger picture issues. There's obviously not enough time to address those shortly, but in my mind, there's the budget issue that you guys will jointly address and discuss with the town. There's potential short-term amendments that could be undertaken, hopefully to reflect the best way to actually administer the contract, as Stephen just indicated. And then I think the parties, if there's longer-term, bigger picture, more substantive, potential revisions to the arrangement, I think those discussions could commence, although that'll be a different time frame, and perhaps with the expiration in 2021, that would be a target for big picture goals. And that was really just the purpose of deciding.
Now, the changes that you're speaking of, are those things that we need to decide as a board before we set in a joint meeting, or we just present all of this at a joint, present proposed amendments in the joint meeting?
I would raise those to the board. I don't think they will change your consideration of the budget. Instead, they may change your funding sources for those, but in terms of the budget and the categories of expenditures, I don't think they would actually change those line items.
And, I mean, if we got to the point where Lisa raised a concern, whatever the staff winds up doing on the town side, especially procedure-wise, it'd be a good idea to sit down and kind of talk about how the true-up or how we want to kind of do on the staff level, what's best for both sides. I mean, I talked to John, who's obviously vacating at that time. We kind of moved forward on this topic. We did actually do a true-up for the last 2 fiscal years. We finally did one here, which is a one lump sum check that we just got in. Or, I'm sorry, I'll take that. We just invoiced that they're taking to their board to talk about it and get that approved.
What was the amount?
135 and some change. So a little bit higher than I thought it was going to be, but
135K?
yeah, 135,000 and about 135 and a half roughly. And that will go in towards, that has to do with obviously the offset of revenues versus expenditures that happen over fiscal year 17 and 18.
Okay.
Roger?
If I could just chip in on that, I guess in my mind, it seems like if this board was open to it, the staff would work with council to propose some small edits to the document and to send those over to the town's attorney to let them take a look at it and see if they're interested in supporting it or adding any small changes of their own. They may have some procedural things that would be easier for them in terms of the blocking and tackling execution of the contract.
Okay.
Okay.
I think that's all.
Okay, anybody else with any other questions, comments? All right, item number 10, presentation from legal counsel regarding bills of interest enacted by the Texas legislature during this 2019 legislative session.
Yeah, real quickly, for a number of my clients, I've put together kind of a summary that identifies potential bills of interest that were passed by the legislature in the utility context and in the district context. Really, this is just an opportunity for you all to see those. If you have any questions, I'm happy to try to answer those or get back to you with the answers. Far and away, in my practice, the one that's getting the most attention is Senate Bill 2, which is the tax rate.
Is there gonna be a handout, or are you gonna just speak to it orally?
Excuse me?
There's a handout.
There's a handout?
Yes, sir.
You have to take the paperclip off your packet.
In the table, all of the House bills are set forth, and then the Senate bills start, so it would be at the beginning of the Senate bill on page 8. And essentially, as you know, in the past, districts have been governed by a rollback process which only applied to districts, unlike other taxing units, but it was an 8% maintenance tax, essentially, and if a district exceeded that, then the taxpayers had the right to petition, and only if a requisite number of petitions were timely received would there be a rollback election. This session, there was a lot of focus on taxes, as you all probably know, and in the past, districts have largely escaped that, but that was not the case this time. The AWBD folks very much participated in the process to try to mitigate the impact on districts. Ultimately, what they were able to accomplish was that there's really 3 categories of districts now for taxing purposes. And before I forget, these really don't apply to the tax rates you're about to adopt this year, but commencing January 2020, they will apply. But there's 3 categories of districts: those that levy a tax less than a maintenance tax less than 2.5 cents per hundred. Those which are developed districts, and those are where the district's issued bonds and has put in infrastructure to serve essentially 95% of the district. And in those cases, those districts, and I need to speak to your staff about this, but I suspect you would qualify as a developed district, are subject to a 3.5% or 3.5 cent ceiling, and if you exceed it, it's not a right for a rollback election, it's a mandatory rollback election. And then the third category is if you don't qualify as either the low tax district or the developed district, then you fall into the remainder, where it's more closer to the 8% that you saw in the past. But and again, we'll work with your staff significantly on this, but assuming you qualify as a developed district, you'll be subject to this new maintenance tax limitation. Your fire tax, I believe, qualifies as a maintenance tax, even though we call it something else. So for purposes of the 3.5%, 3.5 cents, we need to look at both your maintenance tax and your fire tax. The requirements for a budget have also been, and we'll see what kind of guidance is issued, but it purports to state that for a developed district going forward, your budgets must have attached to them, on the face of the legislation, it appears every audit, every transcript for every series of bonds ever issued, and every engineering report used to to support each of your bond elections. So for older districts, including this one, but some have been around for 50 or 60 years, I mean, that's a room full of paper. So it'll be interesting to see the guidance and how this is actually implemented. But Stephen's going to have some work cut out for him in connection with starting next year in connection with future budgets. And this will very much affect your tax rate adoption process. It's possible that this could impact, some of those fire, what we just talked about, the fire ILA. If a budget is presented, which would cause you to have to increase your maintenance tax by more than the 3.5%, that would be a mandatory election starting next year. And so you guys may end up pushing back on that or discussing alternative funding sources. But it's a big deal to a lot of districts. And again, feel free to look through the table. I apologize, I meant to send it to Lori sooner and I didn't. And I'm happy to answer your questions or forward them to staff, and I'll answer them either way. But these are the ones that I think would be of most interest. In terms of municipal annexation, you know, the last session, cities with larger populations and in counties with larger populations, their power to unilaterally annex was very much restricted. This session, that was carried through, so it's essentially every city and every county in the state now. The ability of a city to unilaterally annex folks over their opposition has largely been eliminated.
I would like to talk about House Bill 347. I have a couple of questions I would like to ask in executive session, so when we get to that particular part of the meeting, I'd like to note that.
Questions on Senate Bill 494? That seems to impact Open Meeting Act. It's on page 11.
Yeah. This isn't as big of a deal to you, but just as a kind of an interesting point, there's been a lot of criticism over the years regarding MUDs, particularly the newer developer districts, meet in consulted offices outside the boundaries of the district. So there's, this session, there's a law that's referenced in here that actually amends that and now requires districts to justify if they don't have meeting places within the boundaries of the district, and gives residents the right to force meetings to be within the boundaries of the district. There's also now a right for, and again, you guys already have videotapes. There was a big issue about videotaping district meetings. AWBD pushed back hard on that because of the cost associated with it, particularly for smaller districts. And the compromise was essentially that in connection with the adoption of taxes, residents have the ability to force that to be videotaped. Again, you guys already meet in the district. You already videotape your meetings, so you're a little bit ahead of the curve.
They also, and I picked this up at AWBD down there. They had a briefing. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. 494 was related to emergency meetings. I don't think I heard you address that.
Okay.
And what ramifications that would have for us on a practical basis. Seems to
I don't think it'll have any unless you experience an emergency, but it will, in the event of an emergency, it just provides clarity about the ability to meet.
So it basically says, if I'm reading this correctly, if you're going to have an emergency meeting, then you're limited to deliberate and take action only on the item
Yes.
related to
Regarding
that
the
emergency. And then it also seems to indicate that the Open Meetings Act responsibilities are no longer applicable during the emergency?
For catastrophes.
Okay. Does it describe what a catastrophe is? Or is that,
I need to go back and look, but I think this was Hurricane Harvey.
Yeah.
In large part generated this, but I'll go back and look at that.
okay.
And there was some governmental bodies needed to meet, and because of the way the statute was written before, that was difficult. This makes clear that it's easier in that event to go ahead and meet, and you don't have to wait the 3 days to take emergency action, but you can't use that as a pretense to take other action.
Okay, number 944, seems like when it comes to public information requests.
Yes. So, Watson tried to pass this bill last session, and it was not passed. But this new bill does a couple of things. Sometimes members of a governing body had district information in their possession, and there were assertions that because they were no longer public officials, it's no longer under the possession or control of the governmental body and isn't subject to open records. this bill is intended to ensure that can occur. And even if you're a formal official, if you have district business, you must make it available under the act.
To download yourself.
Some of this stuff I feel like most people would already say that was the law, but this eliminates any argument to the contrary.
Okay.
They were at AWBD, they were talking about the requirement to bring in your electronic devices when you're no longer on the board and download the information in them so that it's available in the open meeting stuff, or in the open record stuff.
And if I'm an official, I want to do that, just so
Yeah.
I don't have to deal with it going forward.
That's why it's on the MUD's computer. Go ahead, did you have others?
That was it for me.
Senate Bill 1640 was walking quorum, which was reworded as a result of some legal cases.
Yeah, last December, the Court of Criminal Appeals declared that the provision of the Open Meeting Act relating to walking quorums was unconstitutionally vague, because if an official had no knowledge or information that if it spoke to another official that he or she may speak to another one, and they said that's inappropriate to say that's a criminal violation when that wasn't, you had no knowledge of that, no intention of that. And so this is again another Kurt Watson bill, but it addresses that deficiency essentially by stating if one director knows and intentionally meets with another with the purpose of reaching a final decision outside of an act, that's the walking quorum that's prohibited.
Yeah.
So it addresses that vagueness that the Court of Criminal Appeals struck down.
I had the impression when I read it the first time that if you were the first person that got asked, were involved in a conversation, and you didn't know the subsequent one was going to happen, you're out of the case. You're kind of scot-free. It's kind of ties the guy in the middle more.
Yeah, although if you're the first person and you know.
If you know what's
person
going
B is
forward,
gonna,
yeah,
then you're
yeah.
definitely in the
Yeah,
loop.
then you're in it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Senate Bill 943. My note says public information requests go direct to contractors. Or it used to have to come, I don't remember what, I just have a note on that.
So, yeah, the Supreme Court a couple of years ago made a ruling that, or the Attorney General, I should say, that very much protected trade secrets and was used very broadly to exempt contracts and information. And so, again, this is one of Watson's efforts to close that loophole and make it more narrow.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, I was asked by Harmon to table item number 11 till we return from executive session. Does anyone have any concerns with doing that?
No.
Hearing no objection, we'll go to 12. Consider and take appropriate action regarding the district water quality sampling program, including approval of incentives for customer participation.
Mr. President, thank you. We are coming up on our, if it happens every 3 years, is that triennial or triannual? I forget.
Triannual.
Every third year, we have really good results on our lead and copper sampling, but every third year, we have to take and submit samples for lead and copper throughout our system. We have a sampling plan that's approved by TCEQ. It shows 40 different homes, and the number of, it might have a business in it too, actually. I don't know about that, but it's usually residential connections. We have an approved sampling plan with TCEQ with 40 homes on it. And to comply with the lead and copper rule, we have to have 20 good samples come in, go through the process. Now, the lead and copper rule was really one of the first rules that moved the compliance point beyond the meter to the tap inside the house, right? So, effectively, the sample procedure is we drop off at a certain home a sample bottle. They have to not use their water through the night and take the sample first draw in the morning to get the highest possible level of dissolved lead and copper in the sample. It's a worst-case scenario item. So this becomes an issue. Some people have trouble not using water from 10 o'clock at night till 5 in the morning when the sample gets taken. And it's a burden on our homeowners. We'll be sending out a letter like we did a few years back, asking those customers on our list to volunteer and help us with this. Some folks actually apply an incentive to it. So for example, I've got this article from Pflugerville where they're offering those people who help the district comply a $50 bill credit. I don't know that ours needs to be that big, but in Raleigh, North Carolina, we provided, I think it was like a $25 gift card to those who helped us out. It's a fairly involved process. They have to not use water all night. They have to take the sample first draw in the morning and set it out on the porch where we pick it up and send it off to our laboratory. We get the results back. All of that gets sent off to TCEQ to ensure that we're in compliance with the rule. So I guess I wanted to throw it out. But it's kind of an area where, you know, if we, for example, did a $25 gift certificate or even a $50 bill credit, we're not talking about an enormous amount of money. $50 with 20 successful samples, that's $1,000.
So I guess one question is, can I volunteer to do it 40 times?
No. The actual submission of the sample plan is somewhat involved. They want to make sure that you're getting the homes most likely to have lead and copper to paint the worst case scenario.
That wouldn't be you.
You know, in some cases, they want, like I'm reading the headline here, of course, they've had to expand their sample plan. So Pflugerville went from 50 to 288 samples in the course of 5 years to comply. So it's growing rapidly down there around Austin. And they were specifically looking for homes that were built after 1983 without water softeners. So water softeners play a role as well in this process. I think I would recommend that we consider giving a $25 bill credit.
Have we ever encountered difficulty with getting compliance?
I guess I would ask Mike that.
I wouldn't say in compliance. I mean, we have had to take maybe 2 or 3 trips out, you know, contact people before, all that stuff to make sure we get all of our samples. I mean, usually every time you do lead and copper, I'm sure every utility, you know, finds those people that, yeah, I'll do it, and you go back 3 or 4 times, and you're like, okay, well, are you gonna do it? If not, we'll pick somebody else, because we gotta get these samples in.
So will paying somebody $25 change that behavior?
It's been my experience that it at least makes people happier to deal with it. You know, outside of that, you're asking your customers to take samples, handle sample bottles. They do have preservatives in the sample bottles. It's part of the analytical method. So for a GC mass spec sort of thing, you got to put in something to neutralize that lead and copper and fix it. And whatever's dissolved is what's there. Then it can be held in a laboratory for weeks before it goes. But you have citizens handling sample bottles that have reagents in them already. And there's a procedure. They got to read the procedure. They got to follow it. And I think they have to certify that they followed the procedure.
They do have, they
My
do sign
recollection
it.
is there's a form. They're attesting to the fact that they've done this.
Do you have a recommendation?
I do. I recommend that you authorize the general manager to apply a $25 bill credit and to describe it in the letter that's going out to our sample list.
Okay with me?
I'll entertain a motion. Come on, Smiley.
I make a motion that we authorize our general manager to, our staff to implement a district water quality sampling program, including an approved $25 credit on a customer's bill for those that participate in the program.
We have a motion by Director Chapman to authorize staff to include a $25 incentive for customer participation in the district water quality sampling program.
Second.
We have a second by Secretary Treasurer Flynn. Are there any discussion?
I have a question based on the motion. Do I get credit for participating if I take the sampling bottle, don't do it, and give you the sampling bottle back?
No.
No.
Are directors allowed to be a part of this?
If your house is selected, I would assume.
I believe you have to be on the official sampling plan, and it's my understanding that none of our directors are on that officially approved TCEQ sampling plan.
Might be a conflict of interest.
That, yeah, that's what I was curious.
Yeah. So that would exclude me from being able to do it 40 times. Would you recommend a successfully complete? So I guess I'll amend my motion to say successfully complete the requirements of the district's water quality sampling plan to satisfy our very inclusive Vice President Rose.
Can I have a second?
Yeah, waiting on a second.
Second.
Second by Secretary Treasurer Flynn. Okay, any other discussion? Okay, well, oh, you have a, okay, well, I was about to, I thought you was about to amend it again.
No,
See how far we can go down this rabbit hole.
voting.
Okay. First, we'll vote on the amendment to state that the customer has to successfully complete participating in the district water plan. Any discussion or questions there? If not, all in favor indicate by raising your hand. Amendment passes unanimously. Now we'll address the motion as amended. Everyone still understand the initial motion? All right, if there are no other discussions, all in favor indicate by raising your hand. The motion passes unanimously. Okay, item number 13, consider and take appropriate action regarding the 2019 Combined Financials and Variance Report. Secretary Treasurer Flynn, please enlighten us.
I plan to do that, as always. Stephen is going to get into some, at some later point, budget issues, so I don't want to talk about those here anyway. But if you'll go to page 157 on the variance report, I do want to call your attention to one item that looks a bit odd, and that is property taxes / fire delinquent. It's a negative number for the month of 5308. And I am going to let Stephen explain what that is exactly.
Okay, so what happens usually once a year, we get what's called a tax shortage. Basically, it is a refund that has to go back to a taxpayer at some point in time from Denton County or Tarrant County. This could be for various reasons. Usually a citizen is fighting the valuation that's set by the tax appraisal. It sometimes go into an attorney in litigation. It can kind of go past longer terms. Sometimes it goes past something 4 or 5 years ago that it was resulted that the taxpayer was going to get a credit back. Say for instance, for this one, Denton County, they come to an agreement on what the tax valuation should be. It almost counts as the taxpayer did an overpayment, which means we received too much taxes over the years. We now have a certain time frame to pay that back, so that way the citizen gets that money back. So in a way, looking at it as a reverse revenue, I guess in a way of looking at it, because it goes towards delinquent taxes because it was partly of the fiscal year prior to last year. So it is for delinquent taxes. So now you have what resulted in a negative here. Most times what happens is the amount is fairly small. Basically it kind of gets shuffled in and you don't really see it because every day we're getting deposits coming in. This amount was pretty big. I didn't feel that we could get this paid off in a reasonable amount of time before it was due back, so we paid a check to Denton County to pay the citizens that needed, to pay them back for the tax shortage. So that required basically a 1 month hit. This one was a $14,500 ACH that went out to Denton County, so it was in for the month of May. So what happens is part of that now, some of that has stuff that's in this fiscal year, a few people this fiscal year, but there was one prior payment that went out for last fiscal year, and then that gets broken up in all the different 533 and the fire tax, the mud tax, and all that is based on the rates of the year that it got taken effect. So at the end of the day, it kind of creates a negative revenue, a negative amount on there.
Roger?
Makes sense.
On page 158, I have a water question. Meter change-out program, is it 99.9894%? Are we through buying meters for meter change-out program? Is that what we're telling ourselves?
That's because, yes, we have purchased those supplies. So
Okay.
we are done with that
We're
now.
done with that. Thank you.
So when are we gonna address that .06?
The what?
We're going to flow it across into insurance reserves. Lab analysis is up there, but will probably increase, I would anticipate, and go above 100%.
We will. And we'll also do it wastewater too, because wastewater lab costs actually went up this year
Per test.
per test.
Gotcha.
Other questions? If not, I move to approve the May 2019 combined financial and variance report. That's A, combined financials, and B, combined variance report.
Second.
We have a motion by Secretary Treasurer Flynn to approve the May 2019 combined financials and variance report. It was seconded by Vice President Rose. Any discussion?
Can I do a discussion real quick? on that also?
Absolutely.
All right. If you would, will you tune, this kind of goes into reserve policy we were talking about before. I kind of want to show you an
Hey, go back.
example.
No.
Oh, we can't.
Denied.
It's for the financials here, but it kind of talks about that. Let's go down to page 71. I was expecting, Bill, to bring this up and see if you would.
71?
71.
71.
Couldn't let it go, could you?
There's an echo.
No,
over here.
I like to bring out there. 71, you're going to see one of my balance sheets. This is the balance sheet for Fund 35, 135, 22, and then 137, the GASB. If you do scroll down, you'll see that negative 116, 613 down there.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so what that is the amount of money we transferred over as our budget amendment for the needs for the VFD. I'll wait till everybody gets there.
It's 71.
Page 71, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, when you hit enter, you'll get there.
yeah.
Okay, so kind of what we were talking about before, you know how we want to do a certain amount set aside for each reserve. If you go down towards the bottom, you'll see fund balance down there. You'll see with the fund balance for the water replacement. We moved this money. This was appointed by the board for me to move this money out of our replacement reserve that we have to pay for the VFD. That's going to be shortage basically from what we had in the capital. Is everyone familiar with that? So basically what we'll need to do is do a budget amendment. We pulled it all out of the GASB side of it, which was reserved from that. Obviously we didn't have enough in there, so we'll have to pull money from one reserve to another reserve to even this out. The account itself is not negative, but what is dog-eared for the water replacement is. So we'll have to pull it from our secondary reserve, which is capital replacement versus the GASB that we have. This is kind of the point I was trying to get across. When we start to give ourselves such strict percentages or amounts, these kind of things will happen on the books here. Even though our accounts are positive, it shows on here as a negative until I transfer this back around.
So this happened during one of the last two meetings?
Correct. So this happened when we did I wasn't here for the last one. I was in training the day we had the meeting. That was the month that we did. So we did it last month. I wanted to talk about it before we did anything else. So
This was when we did the budget.
When we did when we adopted the amended budget, and it was asked to, at that time, a few of the provisions was, hey, let's go ahead and move money out from the capital replacement to pay for the VFD that's coming up here that needs to be replace the shortage that was there.
Just want to get clarification. So the meeting that the president and the finance director's out, they're spending money like drunken water directors.
And then the point is what? Yes.
Point is I wouldn't approve an amended budget that was a negative, that was an unfunded amended budget. I said, you're gonna have to transfer the money from someplace,
I'm just giving you grief.
and we got it.
So just let's show that out there because, you know, I hate seeing, obviously, we don't want to see a negative
missing
amount.
another
So
meeting if you
I'll
don't
move,
spend
we'll have
like
to do,
that.
when we do the amended again, we'll pull it from another reserve to equal this out, to show there's nothing in this particular reserve dog-eared part. But this shows that, you know, the count is positive. Obviously, the count's 516,000 in there. But when you start doing restrictions on it, then you start having to pull this money from other reserves to cover the other reserves from there. So just kind of give you an example of what we were talking about earlier.
If your reserves were adequate, you wouldn't be doing that.
No comment.
Don't even address, yeah.
Yeah.
Hold on.
What page are we on now?
Any other?
There was a motion already out there, yes.
Yeah, there was a motion. Any other discussions? Apparently not, as he drinks his water.
I'm good. I'm done tallying myself. I'm good.
Okay. Nope, finance director hurt his arm, patting himself on the back.
That wasn't bad.
Okay, hearing no other discussion, all in favor indicate by raising your hand. Motion passes unanimously. Now, we have reports and updates. General manager, monthly reports and updates, A, regulatory update, B, capital improvements, interconnect water transmission line, phase 2, wastewater treatment plant upgrade project. C, system repairs and replacement. D, water system operations. E, wastewater system operations. F, financial update, audit update, utility billing report, permits collected, cash report, water revenue outlook.
Mr. President, my report is in your packet, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. But I would like to drive right to this graphic, which is our revenue shortfall. That's the most significant thing to talk about tonight. And we'll put it right back to Steve. And I would note that our board president and our finance manager were not here for the last 2 board meetings. And those board meetings finished really pretty quickly. We got Tony home by midnight.
Mm-hmm. That is true. Gonna bring that up.
If we spent a lot of money, we spent it quickly.
That's comforting. So no
Okay.
consideration went as you were blowing the budget. See what happens when you leave Vice President Rose in charge. All this fiscal discipline goes out the window.
We just followed procedures.
All right, so the page we're looking at is 170, which has these 4 wonderful graphs that the finance department put out.
Thank you.
It's got, you want to say credit to Desiree, who helped me out a lot trying to get all this done before last week here in time. All right, so what we have here is, I'll kind of walk through the first step. So what we have is from the current fiscal year, from October till May, is what we're looking at, the 2 top charts, the blue and the kind of a beige color here. The first one is water consumption, so these are the amount of gallons that we have used from what was budgeted in the red to what the actuals are in the blue. And we can start with that if anybody has any questions with that.
That was a conservative budget also.
That was a conservative budget. I do want to go on the record that that our area is getting close to the record of a 12-month period of how wet it is. I mean, it is fairly wet out here, obviously. You know, we are conservative in the budget side, but this is pretty wet out here for the last 12 months consecutive. So if you look at when we started for the year, obviously October, we were well down in October from when we started out. This has to do with starting the fiscal year from September of ending last year to the beginning of this year. We were significantly less going into right away. Let's go ahead and move to the revenue side, where most everybody kind of understands the numbers here. So the revenue coming in is, a lot of this is going to be coming in from the usage of September going forward here, minus some accrual that we do. We have to pull out to go back into last fiscal year. But as you can see, we start out with quite a bit less revenue, and then we start to get closer to hitting our budget. And we're at a point now, over these last 2 months, as Director Flynn and I were talking about, we're starting to pull away again. The weather's picked up. We've had a lot of big storms out here, and naturally, most citizens aren't watering their grass, besides a few occasional who have the sprinkler going all the time. So, for the most part, we were significantly under in revenue. So if you want to scroll down here to the next two, so the first one I have is total budget consumption. These are done by consumption. So this is, millions of gallons here. What I did is took the trend that we are for this year and kind of looked at going forward for the next few months left of this fiscal year. Where are we looking at finishing? So kind of have it as a conservative number that maybe we're not going to hit our projection over the next 3 months for just those 3 months. If the trend continues, this is where I'm looking at as far as consumption. And then the main information here is going to be your last chart here, which shows the total revenue on the first two bar charts, and then the total net revenue on the next two. So the total revenue, once again, projecting what we're going to finish out this fiscal year, it looks like we're going to be roughly 1.5 million short on revenue for water only. So we're not talking about overall revenue taxes, and it's strictly just looking at the water side of it here. This goes from not only water use, but also utility fees, disconnects, different things that go along with the water source here. And then what you have is the total net revenue on your next two. This is taking consideration the cost for Fort Worth. Obviously, if we're not buying it, there's not as much cost there. So we're looking at about a net of about $500,000 if everything goes the way it is right now, a loss in revenue from what we budgeted.
So this kind of goes back to each month I've been a little concerned in bringing it up on our financial reports of the revenue side on water, which is significantly below what Stephen said. I mean, we're only tracking to like 38% at this point in the year, way, way, way below where we should be, knowing that it's, seasonal. But still in all, best projections, right, Stephen? We're a $500,000 short, which is concerning.
I mean, these could always change. Obviously, it's hard to predict what the weather's going to do. I mean, if we go back to what a normal summer should be, we can make this ground up potentially, or at least close the gap. But from the trend that we're looking at the last 12 months, I mean, it looks like it's going to continue to be wet. I mean, I don't know the best way of saying what's really going to happen. So right now, the trend, I would say that we're about 15%, give or take, off right now on average of the months. And that's kind of what I did the trend for the next 3 months is be 15% off of what the projected revenue is going to be for the budget.
And not only is it wet, but it's relatively cool. Right. Vice President Rose?
Okay, so that's really good. Now, one of the things I've noticed as I go through the expenses is we are being very conservative, or the expenditures aren't up to the percentage level mark that you would anticipate for this point of the year. Not only for water, but other things throughout the budget overall. So do you have a cumulative analysis between expenses?
I actually, we are tracking fairly flat when it comes to revenue and expense differences. So I did a graph on this, and it became almost, it's just a flat chart basically. So it's not a lot of deviation between the reduction in revenue versus reduction in expenses. They're basically flat between the two.
So
Now, expenses are a interesting thing. Obviously, just like revenue, water revenue, it's not a flat line. We spend certain things at the end of the year versus the beginning of the year. So there are certain things that's going to be picking up as we go the next 3 months. Of course, then again, you have things if we're not using as much, we're selling as much water, potentially we can have less issues, breakdowns, different things could happen that would be less than it would be if we on a normal year too. So, it all kind of goes hand in hand in a way, but there are a lot of variables out there still. But, this is supposed to be our biggest next 3 months, supposed to be our biggest of the year of usage. And if we're not using it, obviously we're not buying it. We have less machinery or pumps or anything can go down. I mean, these things can all be reduction in expenses. But then again, it could be dry the next 3 months and hit triple digits for the next 45 days. I mean, it possibly could happen. I mean, I just try to do it on a conservative basis and say that, you know, we're tracking about 15%, I would say, of the next 3 months, 15% less than what we budgeted for, and that's kind of what I did. And then we did a bunch of calculations as far as what the actual cost of what the fixed cost of Fort Worth is versus the variable cost. We did analysis on that, and that's kind of the trend that we're showing, about $500,000 off.
Okay, are all of our employee positions filled?
They're not.
Still not. What do we have open?
Currently, right now, we have 3 positions open. We did have one filled and kind of did a revolving door real quick for some of the reasons on there, but we're a little bit.
What positions do we have open?
We have 2 water position front lines open, and we have a position that we're not sure the full direction of it, but there is another admin position that would be open as far as communications. That role was kind of split out. Laura's doing like the website and stuff. Some of that's been kind of split out different ways. And, you know, whether it be system analysts. So, I mean, there's different things we can do, but we have another admin position open on
Okay.
there. So we have 3 positions open currently.
Okay.
So we're working on a modified job description, so it wouldn't be a direct replacement of the communications director position, which has been open for some time. The other individual came. He was well qualified. He took a job and he was gone within a week for nearly $10 an hour more is what I heard. So
Is that on the water side? Is that what we're talking about?
Yep.
So, do we need to look at our salary structure at that? I mean, was a question I ran into at AWBD. Somebody says, hey, how are you doing getting employees and employee turnover and that type thing? So,
there's, you know, one of the problems with salary surveys is that we really only compare with ourselves, right? So if we, as an industry, underpay our water and wastewater operators, when we compare ourselves to each other, we're going to come out and show that we're quite comparable. I would reiterate what I told the board when we were considering the salary survey. We know that we have an interest in attracting and retaining the best and brightest folks for our team. Southlake has gone so far as to put it right on their website. We're going to do a salary survey and just add 10% to it, because we suspect that people who are running our water and wastewater systems probably can't live in Southlake, but we certainly want to still attract above average folks. And so that's actually built right into their philosophy. There's other ways to go about doing that, but certainly this would be one where just the demographics in the industry, we don't have a bunch of people Stephen's age that have got 8-10 years of operations experience. You got a lot of folks with 40 years, and you've got a few with a couple years, but trying to find a seasoned veteran it's a challenge.
And there's no secret. The trend right now in the market is a lot of indies are hurting right now. There are a lot of positions that are open, and they seem to. We've posted on several different areas, and we seem to get lost in the weeds or lost in the shuffle as some of the bigger entities out there that we can't keep up with financially. I mean, it's just the nature of how big they are and where we are, that we're kind of being blown out as far as. I mean, we're getting some applicants in, and you know, we get to a point right now where, you know, it's a struggle to I guess to keep. And you know, the real quick turnaround. We changed our process up in HR here. We made it a lot quicker for an interview and for a turnaround to get them in the door. I mean, we've had several of them that have gone through the interview, and then before we know it, they're off somewhere else at the same time. So we try to speed everything up and get it going. But unfortunately, the last candidates
positions been vacant?
I've had one vacant for probably at least 2 years.
Oh, geez.
Well,
Okay.
one of them was something that we, you know, when we first talked with the one, we did a trainee on there, and then we shuffled people around. So it was kind of a.
But I've had a
Yeah.
position open
Yeah.
for probably 2 years. But now I will say that I don't think this is just relevant just to us. I mean, the water, wastewater industry is a standard. I mean, they're hurting everywhere. Nobody is just going into the field anymore. You know,
Yeah, but
they don't teach a college course for water and wastewater, and you come out with a 4-year degree and say, okay, I'm gonna go fix main breaks.
when there's a drowning going on and you're the guy that's in the water, it's 100%. Okay?
Is it time maybe to consider maybe some internship program or something where we kind of do training to get people introduced into the field to, we know ultimately they're going to leave, but at least we can get someone in and train them. And Tony, is it, can you have something that says if we train you and attach a cost to it and say either you work this long or pay it back? Is there a legal way to do that, or is that something that's,
No, I think so.
Like a clawback clause?
I know
Yeah.
GCC does have some courses, and I think we've,
So we've reached out
Up
to
to
the
them.
school, and it's surprising that the wastewater, there's a lot more costs for wastewater than there is for water, as far as their schooling, as far as what is being, as far as how many students are coming in and taking it. We've done postings out there. We've reached out to the professors out there. Like I said, we're not the only ones struggling, and as Mike said, there's a lot hurting right now. It's just the industry right now for it. So, the HR side and Mike, we've sat down, we talked about it, about going forward with, with the training and going to train and get them going, knowing that there's a potential that once they get certification through us, that they could go somewhere else.
yeah, let's see if we can work with Tony to see if we can put together some type of assign a reasonable cost to it, where we say for this cost of putting you through this training, then you agree to work with us for this amount of time, or you reimburse us for that cost.
Can we, maybe on your next agenda, just include an item about recruitment or something about employees, just to
Yeah.
make sure if
Okay.
we're gonna take some action, it's a little more.
Can you add that to the future agenda, please?
I will say here, I think it was last week, Desiree gave me, excuse me, maybe about 7 or 8 applications. I mean, and I think probably 6 of them were qualified.
Oh, that's good.
So we get the process of when we reach out, once we get the applicants in, we've gotten to the point where we're turning around in a few weeks, getting interviews set up and getting going from there, trying to expedite the process and get them going.
Do we do it, well, can we do signing bonuses?
Can't hear you.
Can we do signing bonuses?
We construction employment agreement.
Okay. I think we have to look at some
Incentives.
legally improved way to incentivize people to come into the district and remain.
We can talk about all these different things, but
Yeah.
let's,
We'll get on the agenda.
Well, I mean, and most of it right now is just getting people in. I mean, the people that come in and have worked here for a while, I mean, we've got a couple guys, I don't know, one of them's been here for a little over 2 years, one of them's been here maybe going on 4 or 5, our 2 newest hires that we just brought in as trainees. I mean, they're still here.
Yeah.
But I mean, once you try to go out and just procure an operator that's already knowledgeable to stay here, I mean, to me, it seems like they're just jumping to wherever the pay's at.
Yeah, for the most part, I mean, since I've been here, over the last couple of years, we've had some turnover on the front lines there. Some has to do with moving and being out of our policy of being outside the 45-minute time to get here for on call. I think there was a couple that left for pay wise for money differences. Two prior to that, but
One went to the wastewater plant.
yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else, Carmen, in your GM report?
No, sir.
Okay. Item number 15, pursuant to section 551-.071 of the Texas Open Meeting Act, the board may consult with this attorney in executive session on a matter in which the duty of the attorney to the governmental body under the disciplinary rules of professional conduct of the State Bar of Texas clearly conflicts with the Open Meeting Act, or to seek advice or counsel on legal matters involving pending or contemplated litigation or settlement offers, a contractor breach, performance payment issues related to district's contract with Weber Cadagua Partners for construction of wastewater treatment plant improvements, and B, Trophy Club Municipal Utility District Number 1 versus Arcadia Services LLC in the District Court of Tarrant County, 141st Judicial District, cause number 141-299-351-18. Item 16, pursuant to section 551-072 of the Texas Open Meeting Act, the board may deliberate the purchase, exchange, lease, value of real property of deliberations in an open meeting act would have a detrimental effect on the position of the governmental body in negotiations with the third person. Sale of, okay, a sale of exchange or district real property located at 100 Municipal Drive and 1501 Junction Way. B, purchase of easement requirements for construction and operations of water transmission line improvements from district pump station to elevated water tank located in T.W. King Road. And are we allowed to amend these things that we discussed in executive session if
We'll
it,
do it under this one,
under,
under this, reserves the right.
okay. And then want to talk about HB 347. C.
Questions?
Item 15, the board will also seek legal opinion and advice regarding agenda item 10.
Exactly what Tony said. Okay, it is 9:15. We will enter executive session. It is now 10:36. We will return to regular session. Before we address item number 17, let's go back to item number 11. Discussion and action regarding a joint meeting with the Town and Trophy Club, Town Council for discussion of the proposed annual budget and other matters related to the approved interlocal agreement for fire protection services. I'll entertain a motion. Yes, we need someone to make a motion, saying we'll agree to meet with them July 29th. Did you guys
Did
agree
we have
to
a
that?
time?
The draft agenda is there.
Just a second, okay, just a second.
Proposed date on it.
Okay.
Okay.
I move to approve the joint meeting with the Town of Trophy Club on Monday, July 29th at 7 PM at the SWOR Municipal Boardroom.
Okay, we have a motion by Vice President Rose for the board and the town to have a joint meeting at this location on July 29th at 7 PM.
Second.
Second by Secretary Treasurer Flynn. Any discussion?
Your anniversary.
Yes, thank you for
Our
pointing that out.
condolences. And congratulations.
Yes. Any discussions or any other low blows by Director Rose you want to throw out? Hearing none, all in favor indicate by raising your hand. Motion passes. We'll go back to item number 17. Consider and take appropriate action on matters deliberated in executive session. I don't think we made any decisions or took any action in the executive session. Yep. We did not? Yeah.
No,
Well, yeah, but I mean, there's nothing to
there are
comment
no
on from
motions.
any matters deliberated in executive session. Items for future agenda. We added one. Yeah,
Hiring process
yes.
and the investment policy.
Investment policy? Reserve policy.
Reserve policy, yeah.
Okay. Anything else? Item number
There
19.
will be the report from for the employment. Did you get
Oh.
that?
Yeah.
Yeah, update from the
Something,
Carmen,
some committee.
the Carmen Subcommittee, the CSR, the CSC.
That'll be in 2 weeks.
Okay, next meeting scheduled July 22nd at 6:30, and I see B, budget workshop.
That was on there just in case the board wanted to do a workshop instead of the.
I would add to that, we did plan on having a presentation of the fire budget, at least a brief one, at the July 22nd meeting, a week in advance. And I think Wade's gonna give that presentation to the town the next night. They're on the 23rd, and then
Okay. Can you request that he send us a copy of that in advance? So when he gives the presentation, we can ask questions, we can be prepared to answer questions. I think that will enable us to be able to make a decision on the 29th.
Send tight.
Bless you.
Bless you. I think that's all. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Make a motion to adjourn the meeting this evening.
I'll second it.
Meeting, a motion to adjourn was, I just had a brain fart, was put forward by Director Caswell, I couldn't think of the term, and seconded by Vice President Rose. It is 10:41, meeting is adjourned.
More training required.
Man, I just had a brain
Sounds like-
fart.